Welcome to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform's 24th meeting of 2020. Today we continue taking evidence from stakeholders on the committee's Green Recovery Inquiry, and we're going to hear from experts over 4 panels this morning. Firstly, I'd like to welcome our first panel. We've got Hamish Trench, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Land Commission, Joel Evans, the Team Leader of Sustainability and Climate Change for Aberdeenshire Council, and Professor Colin Campbell from Safari, the Safari Directors Executive Committee. Good morning to you all. I'll get the ball rolling really by talking about, I suppose, the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen some, in terms of what we're doing in an environmentally sustainable way, some positive behaviours from the general populace, and in terms of and also we've had some quite innovative things happen during that time and some social cohesion in our communities. But as we hopefully move out of the pandemic situation, how can we take those positive behaviours and lock them in to assist with a green recovery? I'd like to know all your views on that. Maybe if I just take it in the order that I read it out and come to Hamish Trench first of all.
Good morning, yes. So we have seen lots of innovation from communities, from businesses, from government over the past few months. I think the pandemic has brought into sharp relief the way people value open space, public space, green space, particularly near where they live. The ability to actually access Scotland's land and countryside has really never been more important to people. I suppose we've also seen what community resilience really means, and there have been some very good examples and some good evidence actually where community asset and land ownership has underpinned the ability of communities to respond quickly and put in place the support and services needed to help people get through some of the difficult times this year. So I think there is good evidence of the way this and an open space and public space means in this kind of context. So I think there are some lessons from all of that we should be taking forward into recovery and renewal. I think 2 things I would highlight as priorities to be looking at from a land perspective. The first is really the principle of land reuse and how we make sure that we really do keep land in active use and bring land back into use. We're already dealing with a 30-year legacy of vacant and derelict land in Scotland's most disadvantaged communities. There's a real risk of a new legacy of vacant property coming from the economic conditions created by the pandemic. And then secondly, of course, we really need to make sure that we have the governance and mechanisms in place to drive the pace and scale of land use decisions needed to meet our climate targets. And I think the public support and recognition for that.
Okay, I'll come to Joel Evans next.
Thank you very much. So I would say in terms of locking in and building on some of the positive changes, it would be worth considering how this can tie into building up from a local level, almost building from the local level up to the regional level. This is something that within our economic development team there's been quite a focus on, and there is quite a focus on going forwards, how we can almost work at the sub-local authority level and developing local engagement, local excitement and ownership in what's going on in their various areas. You'll probably be well aware that Aberdeenshire is a collection of towns and smaller settlements. So it's how we can really go engaging at that local level and looking to build, almost a very sort of individual sense of where things are heading for the future in those various communities. I think that's something that we're looking at and we're quite keen to support. The difficulty with this side of things is this kind of real sort of grassroots generation upwards does take time. So we may not see instant results. You may in some cases, but it may be something that just builds over the longer term. And, it's really understanding how to look at success in those areas in terms of the engagement and where that could lead to in the future.
Joel, just before I come to Colin Campbell, can you give me some examples of what you're talking about that happened in Aberdeenshire that you want to build on and work with communities on? I mean, you haven't been very specific. What kind of things?
Well, in terms of initiatives, I mean, this is not specifically COVID related, because that wasn't part of our submission, but there's a sort of Rediscover Peterhead initiative that's going on in the Peterhead city, and looking at how to work in regeneration there. So this could well tie in with a lot of the initiatives around how we're developing our places to be more accessible to people through the COVID various temporary measures that have come in, and how these can be a catalyst for looking to redevelop town centres and rethinking them, I think.
Okay, thank you. Professor Campbell.
Good morning. I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, in terms of locking in positive behaviours, I think what we've noticed is a greater readiness to listen to new ways of doing things and accepting potentially new innovations. I think one of the things that we've experienced is that although the food supply system has coped remarkably well during the pandemic, that could have been very different, for example, if there hadn't been food surpluses in the world. We know that in other years there have not been food surpluses. So there's a lot of new thinking around food supply systems, and others have mentioned localising food supply systems, but I think it's also about localising food energy systems so that they sort of feed more into from the food production side into the local communities. And I think some examples of exploring new ways of doing things, could be, for example, flipping derelict vacant land into food growing land using indoor vertical farms. These are really innovative, disruptive methodologies that I think people are now thinking much more seriously about because of the need to make us more resilient in terms of our food supply system. I think the other thing that people have really woken up to is the importance of nature and how nature really underpins much of our natural assets and our food and timber production systems. And are therefore ready to listen to how do we redesign nature back into our farming systems, and perhaps have high nature value farming systems where there's a premium on the food, and that's offsetting the fact that production levels are perhaps down because we're doing things in a more extensive way with less input. So I think the main thing for me is that people are ready to listen to new types of innovation and ready to try them. And I think lastly, the pandemic has emphasised the urgency with which we need to tackle climate change. And so for the research institutes, for example, we're trying to do more action-based research where we actually do things, demonstrate how they work and learn as we go, rather than simply observe.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to my colleague Claudia Beamish now. Claudia.
And good morning to the panel. I'd like to focus our minds briefly on policy coherence, and our committee has heard evidence that policies and spend emanating from different parts of government don't always align, and we're all obviously keenly aware of this. So on the issue of policy coherence around the green recovery, we know that there are certain initiatives which are either imminent or in future will be coming online. There's the renewed land use strategy. There's the National Planning Framework 4, and later this week, the infrastructure and also a renewed 5-year strategy research programme on environment, food and agriculture. And so I'd like to ask the panel how such initiatives and indeed other policies and spend can be better integrated for a green recovery, and that's at Scottish Government level, but also at other levels as well, if I may call them levels for want of a better word. So perhaps could I come to Joel Evans first? Would be great.
Yes, no problem. Well, we were actually having a discussion with the key agencies group just yesterday as a council. I think one of the things that we thought would be really helpful at many levels on this front of integrating things together is how that we can combine things under an overall vision umbrella, or in a sense of where we're looking to go for the long term. What is, whether it's the region, a town, a city, or indeed, Scotland or the UK, what's that landscape going to look like in 10, 20, 30 years forward? So it's not necessarily that you have everything laid out X, Y, and Z. This is how it's going to be. But if there is a general sense of where things are going, maybe if it's in terms of taxation, how are we expecting taxation to be rebalanced in the future to put more of the value on resources, whether it's going to be transport systems, are we looking to have more localized services? Are we looking to have more hubs across regions with good transport, sustainable transport access to those hubs? I think it's just putting all of these parts of the puzzle into an overall picture so you can get a sense of where we're going in the future, because there are a host of choices that are open to us at the moment in terms of which way we progress, and lots of those choices may well be good in themselves, but they can lead us in different directions. So I think the more work that we can do in looking to an overall national vision or regional visions, I think that would really help in pulling these policy frameworks together underneath that.
Thank you. And could I ask Hamish Trench for any comments from your perspective, please?
Yeah, I think firstly there is a real window of opportunity in the coming year actually to improve the policy alignment. So we have the new land use strategy coming into place, National Planning Framework 4, regional spatial strategies, of course, coming from the Planning Act alongside regional land use partnerships, and of course the Infrastructure Commission recommendations as well. So I think there's an unusual opportunity actually over the coming year to make sure that these are setting out a really aligned direction. And in particular, I think the land use strategy and the National Planning Framework 4 can be very influential in setting a really clear, explicit direction for that. But I think there will, of course, always be tensions within government policy, the areas of government policy. And I think our view would be that actually it is the regional scale where these can most sensibly be addressed and reconciled. So the Land Commission will very shortly be publishing our advice to government on establishing regional land use partnerships. And we do see these as being absolutely key mechanisms to driving some of this change forward. We think the regional scale is the right scale to actually reconcile some of the different choices and priorities in terms of land use to deliver on climate targets. It's the scale that can deliver greater accountability, openness, transparency in decisions. And of course it can connect to what's already quite established regional approach to wider economic and spatial planning. So I think there is a real opportunity in the coming year to align land use planning with the wider spatial planning.
Right, thank you. Could I just ask you whether you think that the land use strategy should be on a more robust statutory footing in order to give it more clout, or whether you think the fact that there's the two regional pilots and now that there'll be more regional land use strategy arrangements, that's sufficient?
I think what we've learned from the last 2 years is that a land use strategy at a national level is sufficient, but not is important, but not sufficient, and we really need to give that traction at the regional level. So I think the most important thing for us is that actually regional land use partnerships are established with a real focus on action. It is, of course, important that they go through the process of planning, putting in place a regional framework that sets out priorities, but actually their focus and their remit, I think, will need to be focused on delivery, action, and brokering the relationships needed to do that. Now, we do think that it would be wise to look at whether those and the land use frameworks can be put on a statutory basis. But in the short term, there's absolutely nothing to stop regional land use partnerships getting up and running ahead of any statutory basis with a clear focus on action.
Right, thank you very much. And could I come to Professor Colin Campbell, last but not least? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just restrict my comments to the land use strategy and the strategic research programme. I would agree with what's been said about the land use strategy. There are issues of scale there in terms of comparing national versus local needs. And there are some areas where we really need transformational land use change, but they're very contested. For example, trees versus livestock. I don't believe they have to be contested. But what the land use strategy does, and I do think it's very progressive international policy, I think still it's the only one I've heard of around the world that integrates land use, and that's a huge opportunity. What it does provide is that opportunity to have consensus building within it. and the right time to do that is during the regional land use planning. It does take resources. Facilitating communities and people with different points of view can be very time consuming. So we need the proper resources going into those sort of engagements and conversations to make sure that we get the right kind of outcomes that are built on trust and mutual understanding of the issues. On the strategic research programme, of course, that's something that's very dear to Safari. It's something I think which has delivered extremely well to Scotland in terms of returns on investment. And I would argue that it's needed more than ever. We need innovation, research, evidence more than ever to make the right decisions going forward. But in the last 10 years, that budget for the strategic research programme has been going down, in some cases by 40% in real terms over that 10-year period. And I'd like to think that the priority going forward is to make sure that it starts going back up again. We can deliver through science, we can deliver the evidence that helps all these deliberations. We've proven there are apps and tools and methods that we can provide that helps everybody to make these decisions, but it does need to be resourced properly.
Right, thank you very much.
Thank you. And can I turn to Mark Ruskell, please?
Yeah, thanks. You've already touched on what I suppose we could call a kind of place-based approach, where we're designing a recovery with communities at a local level. Do you have further examples of where that's working particularly well in Scotland?
Who are you directing your question to, Mark, first?
Well, I don't know, just anybody that has wants.
We'll take Professor Campbell first then.
Yeah, apologies, I can't give you some specific examples where it's already working. I think there are disparate examples of local-based food supply systems where you're seeing greater community engagement. It's difficult to point to any one of them, but there are many examples which appear at, say, the Nature of Scotland Awards every year. You see some great small examples. What we're not seeing is examples of scale. We are, for example, taking an action-based research project for our Glensoch farm, where we're looking at how do we maximise the amount of carbon, water and biodiversity in the farm without reducing the livelihood of the farmer who farms that farm. But also, how do you then connect it to the local community? Because there is a bit of a crisis of livelihoods in the rural area as well that we need to address. So I think as a research project, we can actually look at some of the factors that actually can help to make that much more connected to the rural economy. So apologies, I can't give you any specific examples, but they are in principle a very good way of doing it. There are lots of small examples, but it's trying to get at scale, I think, is the issue.
And Hamish?
Good examples actually that we can learn from. So I suppose the two most established and perhaps the biggest scale examples are the two national parks in Scotland, which operate very much on a place-based approach, bringing together different policy perspectives and interests. We've seen, for example, the Leaving Initiative in Fife take an approach that is more catchment and community-based. So working out from the river that flows through very much an ex-industrial area, and looking at how that can actually catalyse new action and bring together different players for that area. And then on a more rural basis, we've seen some really interesting work going on in communities such as Applecross, for example, who've taken the lead in developing their own community land use plan, which I think has since been adopted by Highland Council as part of their development plan. And on a similar scale, Strathard in Loch Lomond area has taken very much a community approach to catchment management. And looking at the knock-on issues that come from some of the management choices further upstream in their area. So I think all of these actually give some real lessons. I do agree with Colin that perhaps one of the lessons is that we need to scale this up across Scotland, but there is much to learn from, I think, and some of the work that we've done for government looking at regional land use partnerships tries to take on some of the lessons that we can learn from these existing initiatives.
Can I ask, I mean, just a quick follow-up.
Do you want to roll at all to talk about the initiatives in Aberdeenshire before you move on?
Yep. Yeah, sure. I'll come on. Yeah. Sorry, Joe.
Yes, thank you. No worries. Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, one potential example we have is the work that's going on around Huntley in Aberdeenshire. So they have established there the Huntley and District Development Trust, and this has been largely led by the community, but obviously supported by us as a local authority. And what they have done is they're starting to really bring the community together around a vision, a future vision for the area. And projects that they've been involved in so far have involved various green energy projects, looking at the future of whether sort of using green energy to develop hydrogen might be an opportunity, transport projects like car clubs, looking to regenerate the town centre and build up an offering in the town around reuse and repair and those kind of skills, and maybe potentially looking to make that area some kind of hub on this front. So that's one example of a sort of place-based approach which has worked really well. The sort of the obvious underlying factors for that is you have particular members of the community with the confidence and the vision to look to build these kind of initiatives and opportunities, and that confidence and vision isn't always in full supply in all areas. So it's what we can do to actually build that confidence and that vision in local communities. I think that's something that we can really think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's quite a diversity of different approaches there. I mean, the River Leven project is very much being led by SEPA with the community. Other examples you've raised, such as Huntley, it's the community itself that are leading on this. Is there a need for a body to have a kind of a very defined role here in terms of leading that placemaking? Or is it regional land use partnerships? Is it councils? Who takes the lead on this? Because it does seem a bit, sporadic as to whether these initiatives get going or not. And as you say, capacity issues within the community about which communities are able to lead on them.
Yes, I mean, I can completely understand where you're coming from. There are lots of different ways to go about it. And if I'm being honest, I don't think I would have a strong steer from my experience as to which was the best. I can sort of reiterate the points that have been passed on to me by colleagues that, almost different places require different approaches. So very much in Aberdeenshire Council, the steer that we've had and the steer that we've been taking is that, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and it's about engaging with our different communities in different ways. So I wouldn't, I'm afraid, be able to give a steer on would there be a particular approach which would be particularly effective. I could just point to the fact that we are looking at all approaches and trying to make it fit the local communities that we work with.
Hamish?
Yeah, I think there is something here about keeping a degree of flexibility to actually allow local communities to respond and to develop things in quite different ways. And actually we see across Scotland that people do this quite differently, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think, though, there is a clear job, and this is where we see a role for regional land use partnerships actually, in providing the kind of brokerage support to help make these things happen. It's scale that needs to just make the conditions for these things a bit easier and a bit more supportive. So particularly a regional land use partnership can be that focal point for bringing together the collaborations that are necessary. We also think that needs to be tied strongly to finance mechanisms. But there is also something about being able to work quite differently and respond to local delivery and local bodies that are inevitably going to be quite different across different parts of Scotland.
And Colin, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. I think leadership is a key element, and I would agree with Hamish that it needs to be flexible. The only thing I would add to that is to consider the local private sector as well. Many place-based initiatives that are needed will have a distinctive place-based private sector set of companies there. And one of the things that we're picking up, particularly around the climate change crisis, is there are many, many more companies now who want to get involved in local solutions. And they're actually providing leadership in some cases. And because they sometimes have the logistics capability and the marketing capability, quite frankly, they're able to actually help a lot in terms of giving confidence to the local community. So not forgetting about the private sector, where there are key ones there. That's particularly true of rural areas where there are private sector companies whose products totally depend on the natural assets in that region. So it's very much in their interest to try and improve things from a land use point of view.
Thank you. Can I move on to questions from Stuart Stevenson?
Thank you, Convener. In his very first answer, Colin Campbell focused on food, so I perhaps direct my initial question here to Colin in the first instance. And the green recovery, I want to explore how that can interact with the issue of food. But in doing so, I suggest that it's consumers, and a recent survey suggests consumers are becoming increasingly concerned about their ability to fill their food cupboards in a second phase of COVID restrictions. The Freight Transport Association is suggesting 75% of imported transport for food might be affected by Brexit. The government is trying to change our diet to tackle obesity, and of course food exporters, and for Aberdeenshire this is a big part of the economy, are concerned about the loss of markets, and food is one of our fastest growing sectors of our economy. So I'm not looking for an omnibus answer, because clearly there are many facets to this, but it would be useful to see what the panel's views are, starting with Colin, as to how the green recovery can help address the concerns of various stakeholders in relation to food. Colin.
Thank you, Stuart. And I think there are several aspects to this in terms of green recovery on the food systems. One is that we need to start producing food which has a lower greenhouse gas footprint. But there are ways of doing that, and the consumer is very interested in that. We've had a great collaboration with our Biggie distillery, who produced the world's first climate positive gin, and I understand it's one of the best selling products. And you know, people are looking for that differentiation in the marketplace about products which don't harm the environment. So I think there is a lot of scope there for innovation around food products, which is well suited to Scotland and our natural assets and the products that we produce from it. I think the big thing about food is waste. You know, we still waste up to 30 to 40%. We could reduce waste. That would be hugely beneficial. We do actually even then still consume too much, and we need to get consumption levels down. And it's not all about food, it's about a balance between food and energy and fibre, in fact. And there are possibilities in the future about having different types of cropping in Scotland, some of which might address fibre materials which could replace plastics, for example. So looking at re-establishing a sugar beet industry in Scotland, for example, to produce alcohol as a feedstock for industry. And industrial hemp as a fibre crop for food packaging, for example. There are lots of opportunities around green recovery there if we get the scoping, the feasibility studies, and understand what we're getting into there. I think the other area around food is the indoor vertical farming methods, and these high precision control environments give us many, many opportunities to reduce waste, reduce inputs, and diversify the types of foods that are actually available in Scotland. At the moment, that's very restricted to high-value salads, herbs, and all these and other exotic ingredients. But as the costs of that come down, we'll be able to grow a much wider range of foods and localise food production in Scotland, even using derelict and vacant lands, as I mentioned earlier. So I think there's huge opportunities in terms of the food systems. It has to be a systems approach. It needs to take account of all the aspects of that systems in terms of waste and production. And importantly, getting processing capability in Scotland. That's where the jobs will come from.
Thank you for that. I suspect, Joel, given that Aberdeenshire is an important part of our food economy, might be appropriate for the next answer.
Yes, no, thank you very much. So this is not my area of expertise, but I know that we in Aberdeenshire and also our colleagues at Aberdeen City Council are engaging in developing food growing strategies. And I also know from personal connections that there has been an increase in sale in sort of vegetables and edible crops from garden centres and the like. So I know that there is increasing public appetite to get into this area. I think one question that we could just ask is therefore, how do we support the development of the sort of rural and farming communities, whether it's looking into the economics of how it all works and subsidies, and how you also improve the accessibility of this industry to incomers and so on. So I know that these are issues that there'll be many who know more about these than I do, but I do know that actually looking how we can develop and support the farming industry as a whole and support people who want to get into this area as well, I think would be something really key to look at.
And finally, Hamish, and that's my last intervention, Convener.
Thanks. There's little I can add to what's been said, other than to just note, of course, that the kind of vertical farming changes that Colin referred to, are potentially transformational in terms of the relationship between land and food production. So in the medium term, obviously that does start to introduce potentially more flexibility in terms of the types of land that are put to food production, and potentially therefore introduce more flexibility in terms of the choices and priorities we're having to make about land in the medium term.
Right, and we come to Angus MacDonald.
Thank Convener, and good morning to the panel. Following on from that discussion with Stuart Stevenson, the committee has heard evidence that natural capital should play a critical role in supporting the green recovery. So in that context, what practical measures would enable land managers to better support a green recovery? And Hamish first, perhaps.
Okay. Yes, no question that natural capital is of huge importance to the value of Scotland's land and to the way that land management can operate. We're also seeing, of course, the emergence of new natural capital finance mechanisms starting to come through, and we're involved with work with Nature Scot and others, looking at how some of that work can be applied at a local level in particular places in Scotland. I think pretty clearly three things that are for these natural capital finance mechanisms to actually connect practically with the land management opportunities. And that's where local work and local pilots, I think, is really important. I do think there's a potential role here, again, for regional land use partnerships to be the brokers and the hub that could bring together different sources of finance. There's no reason at all why land use partnerships should be focused wholly on public finance. It seems to me that there will be a really good opportunity to bring together different sources of finance, including private and social enterprise, natural capital finance sources. And then, of course, the third element will obviously be the public finance post-2024, post-CAP funding streams. But I think it is very much about, in the stage now, of trying to turn these into that land managers can then take up those opportunities.
Okay, anyone else? Joel?
Not a huge amount to add on this front, apart from saying that from a natural capital perspective on a smaller scale, I think this is a question of how we can start to increase the value of resources, the resources that we can produce naturally within our regions, but then also the resources that we're sort of importing and exporting over our borders, just how we can increase the value of these resources such that they don't become so easy to waste and something that we take for granted. So this would be around developing more local supply chains and closer links between communities. So a large part of this would be looking at regulatory and taxation changes to think, well, how can we readjust or rebalance the values of resources such that they are valued more, they are a more valuable resource to local communities and something that local communities can really take benefit of and produce sort of prosperity and wealth from the use of these natural resources that we have.
Colin?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there are lots of practical land management things we can do to build natural capital. And as much as we keep saying we've got abundant natural assets, many of them are degraded. We can build them much more in terms of habitat restoration. Even our agricultural land, we can build soil carbon levels back up again, which will be beneficial to the farm operations, beneficial to biodiversity. and beneficial in terms of flood management, and also beneficial in terms of the droughts that we're going to experience more of in the future. So there's a lot of very practical things we can be doing, but we do need a strategy around that. We do need financial help as well. And as Hamish was alluding to, there's a lot more private finance coming into things like carbon sequestration in soils. We're talking to Heathrow Airport about a scheme which will encourage farmers to build the soil organic matter in their fields and as a carbon offsetting scheme. So there's lots of imaginative ways coming in there to try and get the resources and the money to help these. But there's a wide range of practical things we can do. Just getting more woodland integrated into farmland through agroforestry, for example, diversifies its roles and jobs in the rural economy as well. So I think there's quite a wide range there, but they need to all be done to make a difference. They're individually all incremental, but it's how do we get them all done as a package to make the kind of difference that we all want to see.
Okay, thanks. And following on from those responses, it's clear that the role of the agricultural advisor is of great importance, particularly just now, and much advice can be provided through SAC consulting and others. So I'm keen to get this on the record. Would you agree with me that it's paramount that farmers and crofters get free access to advice with regard to assisting with the green recovery, with the emphasis on the word free?
Let's go back to Colin first.
Yeah, I think it would be very helpful to get free advice. I mean, the way science evidence is going, it's all open and free science advice, and you see that in the pandemic. And elsewhere, we're increasing the open science agenda by making sure everything is open, transparent, and free at the point of use. So free advice would help. I think we need to maybe move away from just having agricultural advisors and have land use advisors, because it's more than just about agriculture. And we have got quite a divided land use sector into agriculture, forestry, and even in agriculture there are different sectors. And to sort of move into the spirit of an integrated land use strategy, we need to be thinking about land use advisors who are able to advise on integrated land use options for agriculture and forestry.
Hamish?
Anyone else?
Yeah, I was coming on that. I mean, yes, advice very much key, and I think given what we know about the need to shift the delivery of the public interest in land use, the pace and scale of change that's needed to meet climate targets, then yeah, I think it's clear that the advice on that needs to be freely and widely available to land managers, communities, and businesses over the coming years. I think the other thing I would just like to add, and it connected again to the farming kind of and woodland question that's been raised. I think one of the wider aspects around natural capital, beyond the immediate practical implementation, this does open up sort of further questions about the value of land, the way we value land, the way that value is created, and of course the way that value is shared and who benefits. It's an area of work for a couple of years, but also more immediately, I think, for example, the Tenant Farming Commissioner is doing some work with stakeholders at the moment, looking at ways to make sure that agricultural tenants can benefit from and contribute to the opportunities for woodland expansion. So there are, as well as the technical management issues, there are some governance issues around ensuring that all parts of the land ownership and land use and community sectors are actually able to benefit from the natural capital values.
I'm seeing that Colin wants to come back in. Colin?
I just was asking about I think one of the things we're doing within the Safari Strategic Research Programme is trying to understand how advice gets to people. And actually, one of the most effective ways for people to adopt new innovations and new ways of doing things is to learn it from their neighbours. That might not be too surprising to some, but having sort of exemplar individuals who are really sort of pushing the boundaries helps a huge amount. So we do need to understand how people who are managing the land actually make decisions and what affects their behaviours. So it's a much more complicated, I guess, is what I'm saying about just giving advice. They live in a whole community of land managers and they are human beings who make human decisions, but sometimes based on not just the advice or the logic, and we need to fully understand that if we're really going to influence behaviours going forward.
Okay, Angus, is that your line of questioning? Or yeah, thank you. Carrying on, I'm going to move on to questions from Finlay Carson. Finlay.
Good morning, panel. My questions are around the budget that we've seen already. The Climate Emergency Response Group suggested that there should be a £100 million agricultural modernisation fund. However, we've just seen 40 million committed as part of an agricultural transformation fund, as outlined in the government's recent programme. We know that Scotland's national capital is worth something like 273 billion, and the AGER report suggested that because of our natural assets, we had a comparative advantage in Scotland. Can you tell me whether you think that there's enough investment right here, right now, to kickstart the green recovery? We've talked about lots of things just now, but actually, are we in a position to take advantage as soon as we can, or is there a lack of policies and direction at the moment? And that's to the whole panel.
Yep. So I'll come to Hamish first.
Well, I suppose, is it ever enough, given the scale of the challenges that we're looking to meet? But it's certainly a good start, and there's no reason why we can't get on and do an awful lot with the current commitments. So for me, it's less about precisely what the figures are, but actually making sure that we are putting all that to good use in the short term, and actually getting on with some of the areas where we know we can make a difference. So again, it comes back, I think, to there are some real opportunities for alignment over the coming year, and actually aligning both the policy and funding streams, particularly as we look ahead to post-2024, post-CAP funding. There is a real opportunity to get better alignment between significant funding streams from both public and other sources, and the recovery and climate objectives.
Colin?
Of course, and you could spend an awful lot more making other improvements, but we need to know what to spend it on. So maybe initially it's enough, but it needs to be a lot more in the long term when we know exactly what we need to spend it on in terms of kind of investments that are going to make the biggest difference. And I think that's something we need to sort of explore and test and be clear about. And once we know that we've got a very positive direction, we would certainly need a lot more money.
And I don't know if Joe wants to come in. You have said that agriculture is not your area, but if you have anything to add, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, not much to add. It would just be to reiterate, I think, from our feedback, the points that we want to make sure that the biggest levers in our economy, whether that's taxation or regulatory, are aligned so that they do support what we're trying to achieve with our investments, and that we are joining things up together with an overall vision that fits together and sort of makes sense together. So that was all I had to add.
Thank you. And can I move on to questions from Liz Smith?
Thank you. Good morning, panel. I wonder if I may ask about rural strategy, because we've had it flagged up to us, obviously within the Higgins report, and then again within the comments that were given to us by Chris Stark at a previous evidence session, that perhaps not enough has been done about the actual coherent rural strategy that we need to be able to deliver the jobs that we are desperately looking for. And I just wondered if you had comments about what we need to do to ensure that there is a very coherent strategy for the rural sector in terms of delivering these jobs, and that there's a better engagement with government, which is one thing that Bernie Higgins was pointing up to, saying that there had been a little progress, as had Chris Stark, but not nearly enough. Could you comment on that?
I'll come to
Sorry,
Hamish.
Oh,
Come to Hamish first.
Yes, of course. So I think there is a real opportunity here to strengthen some of the connections, and one of the clear connections, I think, for us is about connecting land use strategy and what's kind of often been thought of as rural or environmental strategy with wider economic and spatial planning. And again, this comes back to, I think, for example, the central role that local authorities may have and other players at a regional scale. We can be much better at actually connecting these up. Land use planning has sometimes been seen as a slightly separate with separate organisations from wider regional economic planning. Clearly, we now have regional economic partnerships, we have regional spatial strategies, land use partnerships coming on. There's, I think, a real opportunity here to bring that together so that land use is embedded as part of the wider economic thinking. And that actually is as relevant to rural and as urban land use, I think. And it's actually that integration that we really need to deliver the kind of scale and pace of change to meet climate targets.
Colin?
Yes, I think we do need a much more coherent strategy, which is place-based. There's a couple of things to bear in mind about sort of the kind of, particularly the land use planning in rural areas, is that they're very dependent on what the physical resource, the biological resources you've actually got there. So what's going to count for one region's not going to work for another one. And then it's all going to add up to something at a national level. But we actually have a very rich spatial data set for Scotland. We can absolutely do this. And there's nothing stopping us from getting on and doing that in a very specific place-based approach and seeing whether the numbers actually add up. So we do need to do that. We also need to think through how that translates into jobs. It's going to be very different jobs in Fife, where the future might be a sugar beet industry versus jobs up in the northwest of Scotland, where it might be about tourism built on restoring major landscapes. But we have the ability to do that. And I don't think there's anything to stop us really just getting on with it.
Can I just ask on that point, if I may, Convener? Bernie Higgins raised the issue within his report that he'd like to see a strategic forum between government and leaders in business and industry within the rural economy too. Is that something that you would like to see?
Yes, I think I didn't necessarily catch everything you said there, but I think it was about connecting with business as well. I would agree with that 100%. I think some of the major land use transformations that we need to contemplate around, large-scale peatland restoration, large-scale woodland expansion, these are almost beyond government as well. And bringing in major private sector could help. For example, we're getting a very sympathetic ear from the oil and gas industry, would you believe, around how do we actually go about doing this at scale? And it's not just about their money, it's about their logistics and their professionalism and their engineering skills, because we need to do things differently from the way we've done them in the past. So I would very much encourage getting business involved in all these things. Business are starting to understand that their business depends on natural capital. And they get it better than many people actually, and are very open to working together jointly.
Did Joel have anything to add in answer to Liz's question? Joel?
Yes, and just building on the previous response, one initiative that's just got off the ground and seems to have made a promising start in Aberdeenshire is an initiative called Climate Ready Aberdeenshire. So this is, following in the footsteps of initiatives like Climate Ready Clyde, which I believe you'll be taking evidence from later. So the idea has been to bring together a host of stakeholders from the public sector, the private sector, a variety of sectors around looking at how the region as a whole can develop going forwards. And, this can cover anything from climate change adaptation strategies through to energy transition. And what we found is that we've appointed a chair who is from the private sector working on the environmental side in the oil and gas industry. And this initiative has acted as quite a lightning rod actually for interest from both, the private sector and other sectors. So it really is, definitely something that there is an interest for and an appetite for in looking at regional economic development, realising that this is how things are actually going to be, hung together for the region in terms of the shape of industry and so on going forward. So I think that has shown that there is a real appetite for this and there is a real appetite for engagement. And I think the questions that we now have to ask is, how do we engage all parts of the community, whether it's the farming community, more rural communities? How do we ensure that we do get that representation, and it's not just the sort of usual big players always leading the way? And I think that, referring back to some of our economic development strategy, which is to start at a very community level and build up from there, I think there's value to be had in that. So both looking at things regionally, but also then looking at a very place-based level, and ideally looking to have those two meet up somewhere and find where they can meet and they can share common ground.
Thank you.
Can I bring in Claudine Beamish, who's got a quick question around skills? Claudine, can you direct it to who you want to direct it to? That would be fine.
Right. I'm going to ask if anyone on the panel wants to come in to comment very briefly, but not to belittle the subject, about a skills strategy, either nationally or regionally, and how we can go about this for the jobs that we need for the green recovery. So if you could just indicate to the convener if you want to come in, please. Thank you.
Maybe I could come to Joel, given that we have a just transition issue in the northeast, and then the others can come in. Joel.
Yes, no problem. So we have actually had, through the green recovery response that we submitted, feedback that has indicated that it would be good to be introducing more land-based skills into the curriculum. I mean, this will be more appropriate probably in Aberdeenshire than it might be in other regions, but I would imagine that there would be a sort of a big sense and value in this. So introducing these land-based skills fairly early on, so that land-based careers and land-based knowledge is not just limited to those who maybe got a family history necessarily in these areas. There's also the sense of which we're looking to, in the northeast, make a big transition and use the skills that we have in the oil and gas industry to transfer into new energy, into the energy transition. So this could be greener energy. And also, I think a big chance here for new skills is the whole idea of the circular economy and building more local supply chains. So the idea of the circular economy, I mean, one of the big themes will be how you can keep supply chains smaller and shorter, and actually materials aren't flying halfway across the world, but they are being used as close to being in situ as possible. And I think this does open up a host of new potential skills and careers and innovation, actually, if we can think about, well, how can we use the materials that we have, the materials that come through our supply networks, through our activities, that we would otherwise be sort of sending off to waste or would be causing a problem. How can we look to reuse those materials? So I know, for example, there's work going on in the northeast and also other areas, and looking at how the what would have been waste from fish processing plants can actually be transformed into additional resources, and other wastes maybe from the farming and agricultural sector can be turned into other things. I know, for example, in the oil and gas sector, there are organisations looking at how kits that would otherwise just be sort of destroyed essentially can be remanufactured and brought back into service. And all of these areas are going to involve new practical skills, new innovation, and the potential for really creative, rewarding jobs. So I think there is just a huge opportunity in this idea of the circular economy, where we're not just consumers, where something, appears before us and then moves on somewhere else, but we're actually thinking about the components, the materials, the resources we have, and how we can use them and make use of them and make economic value of them locally. And I think there's just such a huge and exciting opportunity to create not just jobs, but really interesting and inspiring jobs there as well.
Okay, we're going to have to move on. We are running out of time. So can I come to Mark Ruskell? And then I'm going to bring Finlay Carson back in after Mark, and that will have to be our questioning for our panel. Mark.
Thanks. We talked about quite a lot of different areas of progress this morning, but what do you see as the key kind of milestones or indicators that would show that going forward we're actually, delivering this green recovery.
Can we come to Hamish first?
Yes, of course. So a couple of specific things and then a more general observation. I think, clearly, one would be, are we seeing the dynamism, the pace and scale that we need in terms of making land use decisions? And that's where I think actually having regional land use frameworks with a clear picture of what each part of Scotland can contribute to this in place over the coming years would make a real difference. I think the second area is around land reuse. And are we actually bringing the vacant and derelict sites that are causing impacts in communities back into productive use, delivering for climate targets as we do that. But I think the more general area I would highlight is really in terms of the wider transition to a wellbeing economy, are the investment decisions that we're making in terms of land infrastructure in place, taking account of metrics beyond simply financial return? Are we looking at the wider social and web to our investments? Very much in line with the recommendations of the Infrastructure Commission. And the Land Commission has also published recently some guidance on just how to do that in relation to land reuse for vacant and derelict sites in particular. But I think that wider sense of, are we actually guiding our investment decisions based on the wider return in terms of climate, wellbeing and fiscal, as well as immediate finance, is hugely important.
Colin?
With everything Hamish has just said, but also obviously we've got a natural capital asset index as part of the national performance framework, and you would certainly want to see that start going up. It would broadly indicate habitat restoration and habitat condition improving, and there's a lot of things that we need to do which don't come under that asset index, so there are lots of other indicators we need to look at as well. Soil carbon is something that's going up, and I know some people have been calling for a soil carbon plan. So there's lots of biophysical things that we need to measure, including the land use and reuse that Hamish referred to. But we also need those social indicators around community cohesion, well-being and health that are built in. And I know in the Strategic Research Programme we're starting to look at how do we start to build in many more social indicators into our national assessments to complement the very good biophysical data we have at the national level. But there needs to be very targeted indicators associated with particular actions so that we know that those actions are actually working. And that means having a suite of indicators. And that's always off-putting because it appears complex. And having simple indicators like the Natural Capital Asset Index can be very helpful in messaging the general directions. But we need to do a bit more thinking around whether they're absolutely right for what we're trying to achieve.
Right, I'm very conscious that we only have a couple of minutes left, and Finlay wanted to come in with a question that he wanted to scoop up at the end. Finlay.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. It's very appropriate just after what Colin Campbell was saying just now about the social asset index and whatever. We've seen a huge increase in the number of visitors to our countryside with the success of staycation, but it's also come with lots of issues with fly tipping and rubbish and whatever. Is there a need for some additional funding to ensure that natural capital that we have is protected? And could that possibly be through the establishment of more national parks, and for them to oversee some of the tourism and other capital and assets protection in rural areas?
Okay, we'll come to Hamish Trench first of all.
I think briefly, no question that there needs to be a big emphasis on the infrastructure to support the kind of tourism, but also to support the kind of behaviours that people are looking for. And again, in a way, there's some lessons there in terms of how we've applied land rights and responsibilities and looking at the balance of rights and responsibilities and the support that is required to actually look after the natural resources and land. So I think in principle, absolutely a strong focus on that kind of investment and behaviour is certainly necessary.
Colin?
Access is really good for us, but not always good for the environment, and we've seen lots of examples of that. So there is a need for better facilities and protection of the natural environment that we're using there. Some of our iconic landscapes are really big draws for tourists, both local, national and international, and yet nobody's paying for them. So I think there needs to be more ideas around how we do make recompense for those so that we can invest in those resources. And I know there has been a lot of discussions about tourist taxes and natural capital tax, and there's all sorts of other mechanisms you could choose, but it is a problem we do need to solve, and recognise that whilst we want people to be out there enjoying the outdoors, there is a cost around that, and we need to make sure that the infrastructure is there to support those people as well as protect the environment.
Thank you all. We have run out of time, so I am going to have to thank you all for your fantastic evidence this morning. It's been a great discussion. We're going to suspend briefly to allow the next panel to come in. We'll continue with our evidence on the committee's Green Recovery Inquiry, and we have our second panel today. We've got Ian Gulland, the Chief Executive Officer for Zero Waste Scotland, and Kit England, the lead of the Climate Ready Clyde on behalf of Glasgow City Region. Good morning to you both. Both of you are going to be instrumental in helping us have our green recovery and get it working. And I'd like to know from both of you what measures or approaches you think would enable you to support that delivery of a green recovery and just transition, so that it's effective. It's obviously Zero Waste Scotland for the whole of Scotland, but we have Climate Ready Clyde here specifically for the Glasgow area. So can I come to Zero Waste Scotland first of all, and Ian, please?
Yeah, hi. Hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for the opportunity. So, yeah, clearly I think our biggest contribution to the green recovery will be around further transition to a circular economy, which is obviously ambition for us here in Scotland. We've made some real good progress to date in terms of understanding what's possible and the focusing on the areas. And I think now we have a real opportunity as we build back better to really understand take forward the opportunities that we've already identified, particularly where we are seeing opportunities around job creation and innovation, and particularly looking at what we talked about in the past as waste, now we see as a resource. So instead of exporting that material, which is something we still do, over 70-75% of the materials we collect for recycling gets exported out of Scotland. That's a real economic opportunity for us to do something with that material here in Scotland and create jobs, good jobs, high quality jobs, also to use that material back into our supply chains and build in a degree of resilience, as well as obviously local supply chains and local systems. So I think the key for us is making sure that this isn't just seen as a waste issue. It's actually seen as an economic and social opportunity for Scotland, and embed that across all sectors in Scotland. So whether that's thinking about the renewable industry, the opportunities there in terms of material use, obviously looking at the agricultural sector, looking at the bioeconomy, looking at food systems, looking across all of the key industries in Scotland, and really understanding how we can build those opportunities into delivery, into their recovery, into their kind of future proofing, and sustainability.
Kit, can I come for you from a perspective on the Glasgow?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I think from our perspective, we really see there's a very strong role here for government in terms of leadership on resilience to climate change. I think it's been quite surprising really how little emphasis has been placed on the need to adapt to the impacts of climate change alongside a green recovery. Especially when you consider that sort of resilience to pandemics, or pandemics sat as a kind of a major risk at the top of the UK risk register for a long time, and we sort of failed to prepare for the impact of that, and the impacts of the climate crisis are potentially much more significant. And so there's a real opportunity, I think, to build on where we've started as a country and within Glasgow City region, to take that forward. I think from our perspective, the key things that would help are around an increased emphasis on, I suppose, the role of adaptation in a green recovery. So making really clear at the moment the role that public bodies have to play and the role that resilience has to play. At the moment, the public sector bodies under duties under the Climate Change Act aren't really strong enough to force that action to come forward. So we would support that. But also, if you look at the sort of recent announcements in the programme for government and in sort of the budget and things like that, there's really very little money for adaptation activity over and above flood risk. So there's a significant investment in capital expenditure for flood risk management, but there's really not much more than that, thinking about the wider impacts of climate change and making sure we have the capacity in place to support or to implement wider resilience projects. And then I think lastly, the thing that would really help is kind of more detailed engagement with the joint working that's already happening on the ground in regions around Scotland. Whether that be through, as you've heard already, regional economic partnerships or regional land use partnerships, or in Glasgow City region case, we also have Climate Ready Clyde, because there's a real wealth of knowledge there about what some of the practical issues are when it comes to delivering some of the investments and some of the schemes that have been promised, which kind of that local or regional level can help in overcoming some of those practical barriers.
Thank you. We move on to questions from Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I just want to try and see how we can, with the green recovery, help those who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Now, it does seem to me the human population further south, where it's going to get oppressively hot, are perhaps one of the big difficulties, whereas in milder climes like ourselves, and Kit talked about flooding as an example, but more generally, our infrastructure would appear to be under threat by climate change. And more importantly, perhaps in some ways, our whole environment, our whole ecosystem with new species moving into our ecology might appear to be under threat by climate change. So the question, therefore, for both of you, perhaps starting with Kit, would be how can we see a green recovery helping us deal with these issues that I've highlighted, and indeed any other issues that panel members might care to identify. Kit.
Thank you. I think I'll take the two issues of kind of the most people who are the most vulnerable to climate change, and then that wider question of climate resilience, if that's okay. And I think in terms of supporting the most vulnerable people, I think we know that young people and disadvantaged people are going to be hit, or are being hit the most through this pandemic. But they're also the communities that who are going to be hit hardest by the sort of global failure to tackle climate change and the biodiversity crisis. I think it's really important to remember that in Scotland, although net zero is incredibly important, our climate will continue to change over and above when we hit that net zero target because of the global response to climate change. And we're really starting to see that come to the fore. I think, you know, for young people particularly, they're facing a double threat. You know, they're at the moment, you know, there's job losses happening across the economy, and that potential, if we also don't address the resilience of climate change, you know, that potentially has the cascade effect of impacting them across their entire life. But what we have to remember, I think, if you expand the concept of a just transition to cover the impacts of climate change and not just about decarbonisation, we also know that the investments that are needed to build resilience to pandemics also have a really strong element of building resilience to climate change, and therefore kind of provide a really good, I suppose, proxy for where that investment needs to go. So whether that's investment in access to green space, whether that's about reskilling and retooling and providing, you know, new jobs in the economy, whether it's about the resilience of our telecoms infrastructure so that we can all work from home, there's some really, really, you know, dual benefits, I suppose, in terms of kind of investing in climate resilience and resilience to pandemics and the wider aspirations around well-being and climate change we want to achieve. I think in terms of the broader question about infrastructure investment and the wider built environment, I think there's a real point about mainstreaming consideration of climate change risk, and we don't do that very well. So all of the impacts of climate change have the potential to affect all, you know, all goods, services, and kind of things that we in our infrastructure. But at the moment, we don't plan those costs in terms of the business cases that we produce or the need for resilience. So I think there's a real urgency there to embed the consideration of climate change risk into all decisions across Scottish Government expenditure, but also trying to encourage at the local authority level and other public bodies as well.
Ian?
Yeah, and so obviously our work isn't really so much focused on the mitigation of climate change as opposed to trying to stop it happening in the first place. But I think there's two things I would add to points in response. I mean, clearly, as we know, it's not so much the carbon emissions that we produce here in Scotland through our territorial emissions. It's actually our wider carbon footprint. So, you know, over 50% of our carbon footprint is actually from the carbon within the products and materials that we're importing into the country. And when you talk about people in the further south, I think those are the countries around the world that are really suffering more because of climate change and because of the over consumption tactics of countries like ourselves in terms of living beyond our planetary means. So building in that thinking, that approach into our own approach again to targeting net zero, you know, thinking about the consumption, you know, better use of materials, thinking more about, you know, the wider impacts as well as, you know, decarbonising our own economy here in Scotland is very important. So critically for us, it's that it's something we should all be thinking about, both at an individual, a business, and a government, thinking about, what is the real carbon intensity of the materials and products we're using, and that would help those people in those disadvantaged parts of the world. But yeah, for us, obviously, there are clear opportunities in terms of upskilling and jobs. We see that as a real opportunity for us here in Scotland to not just recover from the pandemic, but to provide clearly, as we say, better jobs in terms of reuse, repair, remanufacturing, highly skilled jobs, looking after the resources, a resource stewardship approach here in Scotland with the materials that we have, targeting the key sectors that are already live and doing well here in Scotland, and our future opportunities around that. So, building in a real approach to younger people into this, and they want to be part of it. I mean, it was for me very heartening, and over the last couple of years, particularly talking about marine litter and plastics in the ocean, etc., how absolutely across this younger people were not just about complaining about lack of action, but actually the fact that they want to be part of the solution. They want to be part of the solution, and they want to be part of the future, and thinking about designing the way that the systems might operate, not just to protect the oceans, but actually to regenerate and reinvigorate not just the natural environment, but their own economies. That's really been heartening to see over the last couple of years, and I think that's what we should really harness here in the green recovery. This isn't just about people like myself, senior executives talking about it. It's how do we get younger people into shaping the future that they want, so they can actually, be much more engaged, and not just in their own communities, but the global community as well.
I want to ask you both about the budget. The Scottish budget is we're a couple of weeks away from it being announced, and so you have both alluded to areas in which you think there should be more spend. But I'd like to ask you the question, a very sharp question about which area you think there should be less spend in order to prioritise on the areas that you've said that there should be more investment. I'll come to Ian first.
Is that less spend in our areas, our own particular areas?
No, just that in terms of the whole budget. I mean, the money's going to have to come from somewhere in order to finance the green recovery, and a lot of the things that you've said are going to require a lot of investment. Where do you think that money should come from in other parts of the Scottish budget? What do you think we should maybe leave aside for now in order to prioritise the green recovery?
Yeah, with respect, I don't know if it's so much that approach. I think there are other areas to tap into in terms of getting that spend. I mean, clearly in terms of recycling, a much more focused, extended producer responsibility approach for Scotland would actually generate more money from producers. Now, I know that's on the cards, particularly around packaging, but that's, there's already, there's an acceptance across broad industry groups now, not just here in the UK, but across Europe, that EPR is coming for those products and materials that are kind of out with the typical scope at the moment. So people are much more engaged. We're working with the Bed Federation around a potential voluntary scheme on mattresses. So industry itself is beginning to align around this. So I think having a much more proactive engagement with key sectors who are obviously seeing the writing on the wall, seeing the opportunity to not just get involved in their own supply chains, but actually create a much more carbon benefit for their own communities in terms of industries. But and there's a real potential to pilot those approaches here in Scotland. So I actually think it's about how do we reach out and engage for other people who are willing and showing a readiness to actually invest in the future that we're all talking about now, and how do we align that? And so obviously the Scottish Government have announced £70 million for increasing recycling services across local authorities in the programme for government that just came out. There's obviously £100 million in Green Jobs Fund. I think that the secret is how do we bring those two things together? We just don't look at recycling on the curbside in isolation from the potential to actually create real reprocessing capacity here in Scotland for some of those materials. So picking out, one or two, three, four different materials or products and saying, right, those are the real opportunities for us in Scotland. So how do we merge the infrastructure on the ground to deliver high quality materials for green growth opportunities, which are obviously the enterprise agencies and others are looking at? That's the real trick that we can pull. So it's not about asking for more and more money and like trying to take it from other places. It's actually being much more focused and creative and much more joined up with the money that's already on the table. And I think that's obviously how we can all build back better.
Thank you, Ian. And over to Kit. I mean, where would you like to see spend prioritised? And taking into account what Ian's just said about using it smarter, are there areas you think that maybe don't need as much money thrown at them at the expense of the green recovery?
Thank you. I think I feel a little bit uncomfortable recommending what should be deprioritised, in the sense that I'm not an elected official who's there to make those decisions or represent communities. What I would say, though, is that I think there's a potential for us to be a lot smarter and to make a much more use of our sort of fiscal flexibility that we have across the country to bring some of that spending forward. So, Ian was talking quite rightly around sort of leverage and the role of using public sector funds to create private sector leverage. I think we also need to remind ourselves that there's a lot more flexibility both at the local and regional and national and UK levels that we can all avail ourselves of. So whether that, for example, is debt finance, where we see cities and regions across Europe and across the UK actually, bringing forward sort of 10 years of investments through, issuing debt directly to the market. That's really important. And Aberdeenshire or Aberdeen City Council have a track record in doing that, and have done so directly. But I also think there's a role, for example, around user charges. If you look at how Scottish Water is funding its net zero plan, it's very clear that customers will have to pay a proportion of that. And I think the other point to remember is around the role of what we call monetary finance. So if we think back to the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of the economic stimulus that was provided was directly injected into the UK economy through the Bank of England, rather than the day-to-day spending on the budget. And that money still hasn't been repaid. So that money still sits with the Bank of England and kind of is, waiting at some point for the UK government and others to pay it off. And there's a quite widely held view that probably won't ever happen. So I think we kind of need to, I think it's important to think about the balance of spending on a day-to-day priority, but also to take out, the green recovery because it's so important, to take it outside of just the day-to-day spending and make sure that we encourage a wider range of fiscal flexibility to bring that forward through, for example, bonds or anything else.
Liz Smith has got some questions around fiscal levers. Liz.
Thank you, Convener. It's actually maybe a simple question. It's not a simple answer, I don't think. There's obviously a lot of discussion just now about fiscal levers and who should have these fiscal levers to hand when it comes to government policy making. But I just wondered, in light of the discussion earlier and also of the previous panel, whether you think local authorities should have greater discretion when it comes to some of these levers to be able to set their own policy agendas and tax bases when it comes to, or make recommendations about tax bases from that angle in trying to help regional economies.
Come back to Kit first.
Thank you. Yes, I think we would probably advocate on balance that there's a need for more the local authority flexibility and use of fiscal levers there. I think it always has to be very targeted and very clear that there is a kind of a good case for doing so. But if you look at other cities and regions around the world, for example, where they do use fiscal flexibility like green bonds, it can make massive differences in the way that, in the scale and pace at which ambition is achieved. A good example is Paris, where the city of Paris issued a 500 million euro green bond to invest in energy efficiency across the city. And that has, resulted in massive gains to business, massive gains to the public sector in terms of energy saving costs, as well as carbon emissions. But it brought forward a chunk of investment that wouldn't have been able to have happened had it not been done through a much bigger kind of much bigger bond issuance and over a much longer time frame than, I suppose, the day-to-day budget making that we generally use through local authorities traditionally.
Ian?
I'd echo that. I think people might be aware I'm also part of a European network, ACR Plus, which represents cities and regions around Europe in terms of sustainable resource management. And I'm well aware that quite a lot of European cities have sort of a degree of fiscal flexibility in terms of what they can do, and even regulatory opportunities as well for them. So that does offer up that kind of diversity of approach that certainly others can learn from as well, what works, and that is something that we should possibly consider. It's always, again, going back to waste management, we have the landfill tax, something that's we've talked about before, is a local disposal tax. Well, you could have a national disposal tax or a levy, but looking at it, that's something that could be applied at a local level in terms of, specifically around businesses. Now, obviously, now's not a great time to be talking about taxations and levies on businesses, but where there's clearly a recycling opportunity, it could incentivise both businesses and others to recycle more, but actually, creating a sort of small fund to invest in local infrastructure is particular to that city or to that area, rather than depend on sort of the national approach. And again, targeting specific materials or particular opportunities that they're embedded in that region. I think that's. I mean, the thing about the circular economy is it is very much it's about a place-making opportunity. There are national opportunities, but depending on the makeup of the economy in different parts of Scotland, there are different opportunities. And again, involving different communities or different cities and regions around us really makes this, a much more dynamic proposition for people thinking about what they can, even the skills that they might have within, whether it's, previous industry or industry in transition, particularly things like the northeast and the central belt. So I think that's where we really need to maximise opportunities instead of having this kind of blanket approach, thinking what's right for the area that we're in to really make a difference.
Just one very brief point, if I may. Do you think that would increase the incentive, given that it would bring ownership of some of the issues down to the local economy and the sort of local people as well? I mean, that's one of the arguments that seems to be put across in places like the Nordic countries or in Switzerland, etc. Yeah. Do you think that's something that can apply in Scotland that would help that?
Absolutely. I think one of the great initiatives we're involved in is the Cities and Regional Circular Economy Partnership. We're working with the Chamber of Commerce in Glasgow, Chamber of Commerce in Edinburgh, Aberdeen in the northeast, and Dundee. We've branched out to look at the Highlands and Islands as a zone as well. That is all about empowering people on the ground in those cities, through industry leadership, through their connections on the ground, whether it's with academic institutions in Glasgow, for instance, and the local community and community groups, they're much more, their interface is much more direct and dynamic than we could ever do from an office in Stirling. And that's been a great success, because it's actually, they're beginning to start to understand what their strategy or their response should be, or their opportunity should be around the circular economy in terms of jobs, engagement, and which ones will get best traction, even from a political point of view as well. And I think that is working, and that's been a big step change for us in our approach over the last few years. Zero Waste Scotland is how do we work with those types of partners to make it happen. And we're already getting a lot of interest in the south of Scotland, from the Ayrshires as well, even from Stirling, the Central Belt, about how do we actually take that model and make sure, and they're all different, the approaches are different, it's different personalities, different people, different political makeup, but they're all very, they all kind of get the same principles, and they're all looking for real sizable opportunities that will, transform their local, local futures.
Now bring in Mark Ruskell.
Ian, you mentioned the landfill tax there and options for evolving that tax going forward. Do you think that an incineration tax, the case for incineration tax, is getting stronger now?
Yeah, clearly. As I said, I think for me, it's more of a disposal tax, because, that's ultimately what we're trying to get away from, is the linear economy, which is all about, make, use and dispose. So we can all debate the various merits of one disposal route over another, but at the end of the day, that's not helping. We really do need to, reuse and find a different systems approach to, making the best use of all of our materials over and over again. But clearly, as we see, not just in Scotland, but in some other countries, a shift away from landfill to incineration, then, it's something I think we definitely do need to think about. I don't have the figures in front of me, but, incineration still produces carbon emissions. And as we do make the step change in decarbonising our energy grid, then, burning waste, is becoming a bit of an outlier in terms of, carbon emissions. So it's something we do need to think about and, ensure that we're not locking ourselves in, to a kind of unsustainable future that is based on incineration.
Okay, can I ask you both about alignment within government agencies? I mean, do you see a real alignment in relation to the mission of green recovery between, say, Scottish National Investment Bank, enterprise agencies, or are things as aligned as they could be right now? And if not, what needs to happen?
We'll come to Kit first.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's broad alignment across the agencies that we engage with to help support that. But I think what needs to happen a little bit more is we do need to see a stronger emphasis on what we actually want the green recovery to look like in very concrete terms. So whether that's sort of targets and metrics, whether that's particular ambitions and goals, I think until there's a sort of collective view about exactly what that needs to look like, it's quite hard to achieve that alignment in practice. So I think, we have very good collaboration in Glasgow City region with our regional economic partnership, with our climate change, with Climate Ready Clyde, etc. But I think the challenge is then bringing that to bear with the agencies who can enable that, such as the Scottish National Investment Bank, to really understand what they can, the roles of each organisation in making it happen. So I think, a really good example might be, we already know, for example, there are 40,000 properties in Glasgow City region that could benefit from property level protection from flooding. But actually those need to be, to do that well, need to be sort of subsidised and provided to residents, but could in the very long term provide good insurance discounts. And there's a mechanism there which we could explore to develop a model which, delivers on those outcomes of a green recovery, because it's very labour intensive and therefore will create a lot of jobs in the very short term. But it needs the right sort of finance sitting behind it to make it happen. So I think we need to do quite quickly, we need to come to a much clearer view about what we actually want to see. And then the initiatives and the various agencies will definitely, line up to support that, I think. I think the other point is that we need to, particularly around the Scottish National Investment Bank, is around the clarity of their missions. So it's really great to see a mission around net zero, which is absolutely essential. But beyond that, the kind of the remit around wider environmental goals and green goals is a little less defined. For example, on climate change adaptation, there's not a particular mission around the resilience of our economy, the resilience of our society. And actually, when we look at climate change adaptation, that's sort of listed as a policy alignment under the net zero goal, whereas actually really it's very quite different. So I think those are important. And I think the other thing to think about is the interdependencies of the activities that each of those agencies undertake. So we were talking a little bit earlier about kind of the need for kind of investment in adaptation across everything that government does. And it will be the same with the green recovery. So, for example, we shouldn't be funding activity that may support, jobs in the natural environment, but could, increase carbon emissions. And similarly, we shouldn't be investing in sort of net zero green recovery ambitions that are not, resilient to the future projected impacts of climate change, because that makes them poor investments over the longer term.
Ian?
I think we're much more aligned than we've ever been. I think there's always room for improvement. I think all of us would say that, but I genuinely think there are much more aligned conversations going on with certainly the agencies I work with. I think that we all struggle with the fact that there's so much opportunity now. There's so much conversations, both at national level and local level, and how do you span yourself across all of those? Because they are quite diverse, but the opportunities are real. They're real to people in all of those local circumstances as well. So I think that's more of the challenge for me. But I think we could start to, we can always be more aligned. I think the real challenge is how do we bring in other agencies which are not, specifically in my sphere to some extent. It's sometimes easy to talk to environmental groups all the time, but a lot of what we're talking about is economic opportunity. It's urban regeneration, so obviously, people like Kit are in that space as well. It's about working with communities. Previous speakers were talking a bit about, land use partnerships as well. A lot of what we talk about, is about how we use land, both here in Scotland and, what we can learn from other countries, particularly around agricultural and protein. But I think it's how do we make that space without that space getting in the way of actually delivery. because it is quite a dynamic space at the moment for all of us, which is greatly encouraging because there's so many opportunities.
Thank you. Can I move on to questions from Finlay Carson?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I want to look at behaviour change. Since March, we saw a huge change being forced on people because of the lockdown, and I know Zero Waste Scotland saw its carbon footprint drop by more than 70% on an annual basis because of the people not travelling to work. However, on the end of last week and yesterday, I believe that some of the commuter traffic was back to pre-lockdown levels. So it may be that we've missed that opportunity. So what I would like to ask is, based on both your experiences, what measures would help to try and lock in that low carbon travel behaviour with regards to reducing business travel, reducing commuting and more working from home?
So I could start to begin that. Thanks for the question. So yeah, we obviously did some analysis during lockdown, and as Finlay said, we noticed a reduction of over 70%, nearly 75% of our carbon footprint by just working from home. Now, we've taken steps since then, both from an organisational point of view, thinking about our footprint, but also listening to staff to offer up permanent home working to our colleagues, and over 75% of them have taken that up. So that's, and I think that's, I think that is, to be much more a focus, particularly of public agency. If we're going to demonstrate leadership here, we need to really start thinking seriously about what does it look like in terms of our working environments going forward. Now, I think we were already, it was a trend that people said we were already beginning to think about in terms of agile working, so it's just accelerated that. But I do recognise that home working isn't for everyone individually, and obviously depending on which business or part of the economy you're working in. But it is something we need to embrace. But I think what would help go further is the idea of even, regional or local hubs, particularly I guess I'm thinking about public sector workers, but that could be extended, because clearly that, there is, the alternative for somebody in my organisation who can't work from home for whatever domestic reasons or otherwise, they then have to travel to Stirling. But if there was an opportunity for them to go or walk or cycle to a local hub, public sector hub, then that would again, help the environment. So I think there is an opportunity for us to think much more creatively. I guess I'm talking here again from the sort of public bodies, to think more creatively about how do we transition as quickly as possible, rather than see people kind of go back to old habits, so to speak. I think that is a real opportunity in terms of our IT, in terms of everything that's worked. We've got used to this. Look at this. It was the first for me giving parliamentary being a witness to parliamentary committee online. It can be done. It hasn't stopped us delivering through the pandemic in terms of the ask that the government have given us, and we've managed to remain engaged across our staff and be able to embrace our stakeholders and many of the opportunities we've been talking about. So yeah, regional hubs or local hubs would be something I'd be pushing for.
Kit.
Yes. So I think it's important to say that we've seen, as well as obviously some very disruptive, changes in people's lives, there have been a number of positive behaviours, whether it's, cycling and walking or remote working, as Ian sort of said. But I think what we really need to remember as we come out of this and we move into the green recovery is that to kind of cement those, we need a much more consensual and inclusive decision-making process with the public and businesses and the public sector, because the changes that we need to sustain and secure go far beyond this to meet our emissions targets. We sort of have done the easy, low-hanging fruit, if you like, where the public won't notice. And if we're now talking about, really, eliminating our emissions and building our resilience to the impacts of climate change that are to come, then people kind of need to make sure that is not seen as, I suppose, being implemented by stealth. So we have to really be honest with people about, yes, we've implemented these changes. Some have been really positive, but they've also not worked for a lot of people. And so we have to really make sure that as we go forward and as we come through the green recovery, that, that there is a really good dialogue with the public, with businesses, around what does work, and and how do we secure the best of that, and how do we manage where it doesn't work. I think there's also a point around, the Scottish Government has announced and is starting work on the Citizens' Assembly, and I think that could be a really interesting mechanism for starting to promote some of that debate and discussion about what needs to continue to change, what's been the best, how do we take the best of where we've come from and make sure that we secure that going forward. But I also think there's a really practical point. We've learned how quickly we can implement change if we need to. So whether it's cycle lanes or infrastructure changes, even if they're just temporary, those changes can be much swifter than I think we have previously thought, and so it's important that we also remember that as well.
Right, just a word of warning about time for everyone. Can we keep our answers a little bit shorter, please? We've got a number of colleagues wanting to actually ask supplementaries. I don't know if we're going to have time for too many, but Stuart Stevenson did ask for a supplementary on this, so very quickly, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Convener. It's just as someone remote from Parliament, this year, in the same period, my parliamentary mileage is 15% higher than it was last year, because I'm not using public transport and I've been driving. I'd rather not. That's only 6 round trips has made that difference. So I depend on good broadband. So how important is it that we continue to invest in the infrastructure that enables people not to have to travel? Because most of my travels to Parliament have been to get here broadband that supports the online activity that I'm now enjoying from my office in Parliament today.
Can I have a quick response from each of you? Ian.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, I think that's shown to us as well. If we are, going to go to a home working, approach doing business, then we don't want to, restrict where we're going to employ people from. Asking them at interview, how good your broadband is. So absolutely, investment in all of those things, and even just the technology, the kit, the platforms, the training, all of that needs to come, be part and parcel of delivery. So it's not just, you're working at home, plug your computer in. We need to get better. We need to have better techniques about video conferencing, about engaging with people, about using different platforms and making sure it works. So yeah, it's absolutely needs all investment. That's about us thinking about that infrastructure that we need to maintain and to thrive in this new environment, which is clearly going to take cars, etc., off the road and improve our environment.
A very quick response, please, Kit.
I think it's just about flexibility. So I would support everything that's been said, but also recognise that working digitally does, for example, create challenges around collaboration, and some forms of transport as well, deliver other benefits like health-related things from cycling and walking. So I think it's very important to invest in our digital infrastructure, but as part of a rounded package which delivers the best of collaboration and kind of productivity as well.
We are running out of time. Finlay, you want to come in with a quick supplementary. Can you make it very quick, please, or else we will have to deny other members their opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. I was really interested what Ian said about local public sector hubs. See maybe the government looking at farming out some of the government jobs into smaller rural areas, so we have less commuting and also boost jobs in rural areas?
Ian?
I mean, I think if you looked at that very, again, creatively about where those hubs would be, but you could, potentially see, economic benefit, whether that's people buying coffees locally or having food, all the things that we did in cities and, in our office buildings. So, yeah, I think there's some things to look at how that would work, how that transition would work. And even that interconnectedness of different agencies, going back to that, I can remember I think it was Mark's question about the alignment. It does all of that could help if we were all kind of, to some extent, socialising or working together in different spaces. It could help that kind of alignment, particularly in that local area where there are key opportunities that, that the agencies need to pursue. So, all of that, I think, is something we really need to kind of, to some extent, really identify with and I'd say pursue.
Okay, we're running out of time. I need to move on to questions from Angus MacDonald.
Convener. Looking in a bit more detail at the circular economy, a number of experts have highlighted to us the scope to use procurement more effectively to support a green recovery. Now, the SCDI, for example, has stated in their submission to us that Scotland's public procurement model must be reformed to support more local, sustainable and resilient supply chains, which build stronger local economies and reduce emissions. So, what role can procurement play in supporting the delivery of a green recovery, and what needs to happen to maximise these opportunities?
Can I Kit first?
Okay.
Thank you. I mean, procurement is an incredibly powerful lever that we have at our disposal, particularly public procurement. Last year we spent 11 billion on procurement in Scotland, and it supports 100,000 jobs across the country. So it's really important that we pull that lever, I think, but it needs to be done in a proportionate and targeted way. So, for example, the early priorities in procurement are high emission sectors, if we're looking at net zero targets, but also there's a potential for embedding resilience clauses into contracts, whether that's kind of disruption from any source or kind of supporting building a resilience across the value chain. That's really important, but it's also about balancing that amount across the short-term need for effective use of and efficient use of public money as well. So I think we need some really good. It's a very powerful lever. There's a lot of scope to enhance it from where it is, but it needs to be done in a really carefully considered way, which balances those two tensions.
Ian?
I think public procurement more generally is a massive enabler for the circular economy. I mean, if we get this right, we can, we can create the market pool for, a lot of the businesses that we're working with who, are looking to, establish themselves as circular economy providers, of whether that's new services or new technologies. But they're looking for that, where am I going to sell this to, and who possibly would buy this? So I think there's a massive opportunity to really to take this forward and use procurement to differentiate between carbon intensity, materials and products, and otherwise, and even really start to talk that up in a very public way. So, it's a clear route map that, other businesses can hear that, the future is, if you're going to do business with, the public agencies, you're going to have to think differently about, how you deliver your products and services. I think but it's not just procurement, I would say, I think it's actually the commissioners of the work, in the first instance, to think about this as well. So sometimes it's almost too late when it gets to the procurement people. So I think it's a combination of how public sector can work more collaboratively and upfront to work out what is the best answer or the best opportunity, and how to use procurement to make that happen. But I do think, it needs to think again. I mean, we say this about everything. The circular economy is a transformative way of approaching, business across everything. Everything we can think about, whether that's finance, whether it's accounting. It's also about procurement. All of our systems, to some extent, support the linear economy. So if we're going to shift to circular economy, it's right that we review everything, and procurement would be one of these areas. Have we got the right toolkits, the right approaches? But even more fundamentally, one of the barriers, just an aside, that we enter into quite a lot working with businesses, is the whole thing about revenue v capital budgets. So if you're asking businesses or local authorities to go into a kind of leasing model, rather than buying something outright, right away you're potentially adding a revenue cost to an overstretched budget as it is, where it might be easy for them, or at the moment cheaper for them to borrow money to buy outright. So there's some fundamental things that's not so much a procurement issue, but it's fundamentally how we fund and resource the circular economy going forward that we need to really think about. So it's not just about technology advancement, it's not just about new business opportunities or innovation. It's about how do we fundamentally provide that enabling tools to make sure that this works for us.
We have to move on to questions from Claudia Beamish. This will be our final question.
Right. Thank you very much, Convener. And I'll, in terms of time, not in any way to disparage the really interesting panel that we've just been listening to. Could I ask you particularly about whether we have enough and appropriate training and retraining skills in the circular economy in relation to design and remanufacturing, and also in other sectors? And Ian, you've touched on this briefly already, but you may have further comments from your perspective, or indeed Kit. And then if you could both also answer the very important final question of what key indicators or milestones would indicate that Scotland is on a green recovery path from COVID-19. So just in a couple of sentences each, please.
I think we are making progress on skills. I think previously, I think everybody thought, well, what is the sector circular economy? What does the sector look like? But actually, circular economy is across all sectors. How do you embed circular economy thinking into whether it's renewables or oil and gas or otherwise? So I think we are making progress on how do we transfer skills and look for new skills. But I think it's more interesting to think about how do we get those new skills, through colleges, through universities and into business, because we're absolutely serious about transforming our economy between now and 2030 in terms of hitting the interim targets for net zero. Life is going to be very different in how we do business. So who are the people who are going to be inside of businesses over the next 10 years helping transform the businesses? Because we don't want to see all our business collapse and have to re-establish every business in Scotland. All these businesses are going to have to transition, and we need expertise, we need knowledge in those organisations over the next 5 to 10 years. That's the real opportunity for skills development. How do we get interns or people coming out of universities into those businesses so they can get hands-on experience in that transition, working together, collaborating together, networking together, sharing ideas, working hand in hand with businesses on the ground so that they're actually meeting those challenges in a much more staged approach and winning the wins, winning the opportunities for both the individual businesses but the economies that they serve. That's the real opportunity for us here in Scotland, and then building those skills in and being much more resilient against anything else that comes along, but potentially export potential for those individuals and for the businesses they're working with. The final question you asked about, obviously we're working on a thing called a materials flow account, which is really actually trying to, instead of just thinking about recycling and carbon specifically, but thinking about the materials that we use in our economy, where are they coming from, what is the global and local impact of those materials, how can we actually track them? So I think that's a really interesting piece. We've never done that before, and that will start to understand what the opportunities are for us to be better at reuse and maximising the assets that we have in terms of material flow in Scotland, in our economy, but also how can we reduce that? Because as I've said, 50% of our carbon impact is the import of those materials and resources from overseas. So that for me would start to really understand what our economic and, our green recovery actually looks like, is how we can start to really, really drill down into the issue of material flow in our economy.
Thank you.
There's a really important point about, in terms of sort of skills and in terms of what a green recovery looks like. I think I would start by saying that I think we have a very good long-term framework for dealing with kind of a sustainable future for Scotland. And so a green recovery really doesn't need to deviate from that. What it needs to do is we need to be able to clearly demonstrate how those investments and how those plans are translating through into accelerating those existing goals, whether it be net zero, whether it be climate resilience, whether it be our natural environment and restoration of natural capital. So we shouldn't really be looking at anything different, but we should be saying what are the changes that we are making in our recovery and how are they contributing to those long-term targets. That said, we obviously need a very clear plan around what that recovery needs to look like, because that's how you work back from the skills, to the skills question. I think so we need some clear targets around, for example, whether it's investment in property retrofit, investment in flood resilience. You can then work back and say, well, how many jobs are required? When do we want to deliver that by? But I think the other point is to come from the other direction, which is to look at what the sort of urgent economic need is in terms of jobs. In Glasgow City region, we have about 70,000 people who are potentially at risk of unemployment at the end of the furlough scheme. And so those people, and understanding, their skills mix, which sectors they operate in, and what transferable skills they have is also really important, because there's the potential there to make sure that, we minimise the impacts on people's livelihoods from job losses by, helping those people, and that's, that set of people in particular diversify into those, and play a big role in that green recovery as well. So I would just urge us to do a little bit more about, defining what those needs are in the short term, and then matching, putting in place a skills programme to match that as well, that helps us protect the people who have been most affected so far.
Right, thank you. I want to thank you both for your time this morning. We'll have to suspend this meeting briefly and bring on panel 3. Thank you both.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. We have our third panel in our inquiry into the green recovery. Joining us, we have Jess Pepper on behalf of the Climate Cafe and Fabio Vigliani, the leadership team for TSI Murray. Welcome to you both. You've both identified some evidence of positive community responses to COVID-19 that perhaps could be retained and adapted as we look forward to the green recovery. Can I come to you both individually to maybe outline some of the work you've seen being done? Jess.
Good morning. So I am representing four of the climate cafes with our submission from Perth and Kinross, but I've also checked in with Aberdeen Climate Cafe just to find out what was happening with them. Climate cafes, for those who don't know them, are just pop-up spaces within communities which create a space to discuss and take climate action. As in many communities across ours, there were lots of more people obviously working from home, working locally, travelling less, buying locally, greater focus on supporting local producers, shops and suppliers, and using local services where they could. And also lots more folk walking, cycling, getting out and connecting with nature more as well. Across all the communities that were involved in our submission, there was some level of coordination across communities. So sometimes the climate cafes were connected, or they were able to support with the connections where there had been work on resilience before. But for example, there was lots going on in food, some connected with climate cafes and some just across the whole community, coordinating, sharing, delivering food and arranging collection for those who needed it, linking in with local producers and suppliers. So for example, in Blairgowrie and Rattray, the climate cafe there are connected to a neighbour food scheme where actually their orders increased tenfold, where people were able to buy and access local food, and a lot of that was distributed to the people who needed it, who might have been isolating or shielding. Pitlochry Climate Cafe learned from the experience in Blairgowrie and Rattray and started up their own neighbour food scheme, which was also an outlet for local suppliers and producers to get to people who they might not have the opportunity to get to in the normal ways that they would. So lots of learning going on there. And also in all the communities there were food collection points, free food collection points established. So lots of coordinated efforts going on. Another I should mention, which kind of connects with the skills and resilience within the communities, was that in lots of places, scrubs and masks and bags for kit stuff for key workers were also being made locally by groups who were established to sew and produce those for those who needed them in the local area. So that's just some examples of what's going on in our local area.
I'll come to Fabio now. Fabio.
Thank you, convener. And yes, the experience in Murray has been very similar to, I think, to that Jess was describing in Perth and Kinross. I think the fundamental kind of shift has been in how people have engaged, re-engaged with what really matters in life. I think we've seen a reconnection to each other, a reconnection to a sense of community, a sense of place, a reconnection to nature, to our environment, and a reconnection to a sense of purpose, a rediscovery of the values of kindness. And I think those are the kind of fundamental prerequisites, I think, for a shift to a just and green recovery. Specific examples that have come up, absolutely to do with food, both in terms of distribution of food to those who needed it most, but also in making sure that food was healthy and wherever possible locally produced, so shortening that kind of food chain that really bodes well for the future. Community transport, where communities have come up with their own solutions. I think there is an example in our submission that I would draw your attention to. This is a surgery in Lossiemouth. Sorry, surgery in Hopman had closed, and the nearest one was in Lossiemouth. There is only about 5 miles, 10 miles between the two communities, but there was no direct bus route, so the communities repurposed its community bus so that it could take people to surgery appointments. And so this is kind of demand responsive transport solution led by the community for the community, which is really a lovely example. Lots of remote working and people coming together. I mean, we at TSI Mari facilitate people coming together to learn from each other, and we've been able to shift to a kind of virtual way of doing that, which has worked very, very well, and of course both enlarged the pool of those able to contribute to those events and cut back on the kind of carbon footprint of running those events. Those are just some examples. There are loads more.
Can I bring in Claudia Beamish?
To you both, and thank you for attending our panel. I'd like to ask you both, building on the first question from our convener, how you see these positive responses and behaviours being carried forward and maintained best, and how can we, in the Parliament and Scottish Government, and indeed in other ways, best support and encourage individual behaviour change? Thank you. Could I come to perhaps to Fabio first?
Thank you, Claudia. Yes, some measures may be beyond the scope and the powers of Scottish Government. I'm thinking for people to really engage with some of the higher levels of engagement. We need to make sure that we all have food, shelter, warmth, security, safety, and we don't necessarily have all the levers to address those needs as a Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government level. What can be done, however, is to support those who are already demonstrating a greener lifestyle, demonstrating it's not only possible to live a greener lifestyle, but it's actually far more satisfying and it's far more fulfilling than a lifestyle based on consumption. So there are loads of good examples, both at individual and group level, of those things going on, and supporting those, making sure they continue to be successful, making sure that their story is told and heard, are probably the things that are most within our reach and our gift. Examples, transition initiatives where all sorts of activity is relocalized, bring advantages to the economy and to the just and green approach to an economic system that really meets everybody's needs now and does not diminish the ability of future generations to meet their own needs.
So do you see specific actions that Scottish Government could take in terms of support? And it's not always financial, it might be support with skills development or capacity building or shifts of those kinds, but it could be obviously money as well. Are there specific things that you think that the communities that you're working with would benefit from?
Yes, thank you very much for picking up, particularly on the capacity building. So we have a very enabling policy environment. The Community Empowerment Act is a great piece of legislation that enables communities to lead. However, the risk that come with that enabling environment is that those communities who have the capacity to take things forward will continue to do well, and those communities who do not have those skills or that capacity will fall further behind. So what I think I'm most concerned about is the fact that there isn't the level of investment in community development and capacity building that really needs to happen for things, for, as I say, communities who are not doing so well to prosper and to thrive. So I think that's probably the single place where I would encourage Scottish Government to do more. There are a range of ways of engaging people and supporting people that we can come to. I think if we want to talk about how we can make sure everybody's voice is heard and how we make sure that everybody's engaged in that. But fundamentally, recognizing that communities are leading transformation and they are actually in the best place to do that, and support them to learn from each other and to share with each other so that they all move forward without too many gaps appearing between those who can and those who cannot. That's probably the most fruitful area for investment.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And can I come to Jess, please, on the same question?
Yes, I agree with all of what Fabio has just said. So the response to COVID has mobilised more people to act together, and there has been some building of community resilience that we have experienced, and there is goodwill to continue. So in one of the communities involved in this submission, they identified a need for a community food plan to understand where the needs are, how they can build resilience by supporting local producers, suppliers, the high street, and ensure that is actually adding resilience to the local economy and local community. And actually, they're looking more broadly at how they can work together, because people have enjoyed working together. There's been a feel good about getting together and being creative and active and supporting each other, and thinking about what the shared vision of a green recovery might look like in their community. So that's one example of how they'd like to extend it. Because there's been a break from usual patterns, that obviously gives an opportunity for change, to think about what has worked for folk and what hasn't. But we must understand what hasn't worked for everybody, and that's really important. And I agree with the comments that we need to understand the whole community, and in order to engage with everybody, community development, that kind of support is needed so that people can all be part of the conversation. Because what we hear often is that certain parts of the community can be part of the conversation, but others might not. We can maybe come to that again. But just some examples of how to sustain this positive change, what has been positive responses. So the loyalty to local businesses, people are keen to continue that, and obviously but making sure that happens, that the services and what folk are looking for are accessible and affordable, and they're able to access them in the local communities is one thing. Policies to support people, really what is needed are policies, infrastructure and support to enable positive community responses to be maintained. So for those who are able to work remotely, it may be that not everybody can conveniently work from home. They might not have the space or the peace or the connectivity or the access to resources like printers and photocopiers, but there could be support for enabling community co-working spaces to set up. So that might actually help out some of the public and community spaces that are currently really under threat as well. Obviously, in terms of infrastructure for continuing to walk, cycle, wheel, for everybody to be able to walk or cycle to their work or to their school, or to get to this local services, and not be at risk from car traffic, that needs infrastructure in rural places as well as in urban places. People felt safe when it was quiet and there wasn't much traffic on the roads, and now as that's increasing, then people are starting to change their behaviours again. And also folk are keen to support key workers and essential services that were there for them, their local bus services or rail services, and they want to, that to be an option for them, and to be able to make different choices if that is a possibility for them. So, we would say that the infrastructure needs to be there to enable choices. That's really one of the things which is really important, and that might be policies, it might be support, or it might just be putting infrastructure in place, working with local government and national government to do that. What we know, and this demonstrated it, is that local people know best what the solutions are that will work in their own local communities, and they'll be really innovative and creative in terms of working out what is needed in their people in place. And I should say that, within the cafes, they connect widely within their own communities, so they don't try and replicate anything. They just promote the good stuff that's going on, help observe gaps and connect things up, and try and support people to make changes in their own lives.
Can I bring in Stuart Stevens? to expand this a little further? Sure.
Thank you very much, Convener. Yes, I do want to just explore how citizens and communities can have their voices amplified. And let me just ask you something quite specific. We're now in our third panel of the morning, and this subject has come up in each one of them. But the one thing I've never heard anybody refer to is the role of community councils. They are, of course, a legally established, formal part of local infrastructure, but very constrained in what they can spend and quite limited in their powers. Why aren't they appearing to be part of the driving things forward locally and leading the way? Because it seems to be coming, and thank you for it to all the bodies who do so, from spontaneous eruptions of community activity rather than through the formal structures. And I just want to see, perhaps first from Fabio, and say how privileged I am as an MSP that both the council areas I represent are before us today. So Fabio first, perhaps.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Yes, community councils. Well, community councils are different in different parts of the country, and even in Murray, we see different approaches from different councils. So those are certainly populated by people who care about their community and want to see their community do well. However, the very limitation of the powers that they have perhaps restricts the kind of pool of individuals who might join a community council. And in some areas, community councils are existing alongside other community-led structures, not set up by statute, but as you described them, spontaneous structures that came up in some cases 10, 20 years ago. I mentioned transition initiatives before. Development trusts, community development trusts are a feature of many of our communities. And for example, if I reflect on what I've seen in Murray, I've seen that where community-led infrastructure, like one or more community trusts, can come together, then the community council has just signposted to their activities. So in Forest, for example, Forest Area Community Trust, the Findern Community Trust, Findern and Kinloss, supported by the community support officer from the local authority and supported by ourselves at TSI Murray, they came together, they addressed and supported a distribution of food and shortages of food or access to medicines and so on, which meant Forest Community Council did not feel the need to engage directly into that activity. And other parts of Murray where perhaps that community infrastructure is not so well developed, the Community Council stepped in and they did a very, very good job of addressing those needs. So I think people have, I think as Jess was describing, have identified where the needs were emerging and were not being met and came together using whatever structure they had locally to do it. And where community councils were best placed to do that, they did it. And where other community bodies or indeed new spontaneous organizations could do that, that's where that happened.
Yes.
Yes. So two things probably. The one, in our experience, the cafes provide an open space for those people who don't see themselves as part of a sort of formal structure or liking to go along to meetings where everybody sits around a table and there's an expectation of who you are and how you'll be involved. Actually, the cafes provide an open space which is open, inclusive, accessible to everybody, free. It's a cup of tea, a blether, and in some ways it might be that feels more open. Certainly in our community, we work with the community council and even prior to the pandemic, we were working with the community group, which is most looking out for those who are vulnerable within our community, the Climate Cafe, and this group approached the Community Council to talk about resilience and how we actually build community resilience in the light of more flooding or extreme weather events coming to the community and being something that we would have to manage and look out for those who would be most vulnerable to their impacts. So community councils can be involved, and certainly in the response to COVID, we're definitely involved in the different communities in different ways, whether they were coordinating and connecting with some of the connections that were made through the cafes, or they had different roles within the communities themselves, but they can be complementary, I would suggest, different kinds of spaces.
Convener, I just therefore find myself thinking that community councils and the reform might be something for our local government colleagues in Parliament to think about. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Stuart. We'll move on to questions from Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Convener. We've heard various ways of how the community steps up to the mark, and a lot of it's about resilience. We've also seen, particularly in Dumfries and Galloway, where communities come together and put in batteries to help with fuel poverty and whatever. So a lot of that's top down, and much of what we've heard is very much bottom up. So can I ask how you think the Scottish Government can best support your communities to contribute to green recovery?
We'll come to Jess first.
Yeah, how to best support. So yeah, there's probably two parts to this from our experience, I think. So we know that 68% of folk think that climate change is an immediate and urgent problem. That was the Scottish Government statistics that they were sharing yesterday as part of Scottish Climate Week. So we know, what we have learned is that people know about climate change, but actually some might not feel confident in their own knowledge and understanding about all the connections, what's happening, the science, the impacts, and also what they can do. And what we've discovered is that once folk feel confident in that knowledge, actually, the solutions will just keep coming, and people are really keen to act urgently and do whatever they can. So one thing which would be a great support to enabling folk to feel confident and able to engage in that conversation in their own communities or workplaces or wherever is a national public information campaign about what is going on. That was emphasised in our reports that engaged about 300 people last year, and we feel that would give everybody the confidence to feel part of the conversation. So while the cafes connect widely within their community, and there may be a great deal of willingness to change, and people want to have good lifestyle changes, sometimes they may not know of or have access to accessible, affordable, reliable alternative options to choose from. So we know that even when people are passionate about taking action on climate change and really care, and their children are asking what they're doing, there may not be options that are open to them. So it may be that fresh, local, affordable, less packaged and processed produce might not be readily available where they are, and that's something which there could be help with. It may be that there are not affordable, reliable, accessible public transport options. Transport comes up again and again, something that people would like to change in their lives, or they may not feel safe to walk or cycle or scoot to school or to their work. So that's where local government and Scottish Government can come in and support individuals to give them the choices so that they can make the behaviour changes that they would actually like to do. And again, we've talked a bit about infrastructure being in place, policies that support that, and sometimes the investment that will support that. So the reports we submitted have lots of ideas for action that have come from people in and around these communities. Secondly, the second big chunk of this, I think, and this was the resounding message I got when I was going back to all the coordinators just to be briefed for giving you evidence today. In order to feel confident that the action that they are taking really matters, people need to see government leadership and action. They need to have clarity about what government is actually doing, what the plan is, how they fit in with that. And we've learned through COVID how important it is that government messages are consistent, so government are seen to be doing exactly what they say they are doing. So, last year the declaration of the climate emergency was really welcomed in the wake of climate strikes. Many people, including our events, engaged with the big climate conversation and provided lots of ideas and thoughts about what they thought needed to happen. But what folk are saying at a local level is that they don't see the urgent action on the ground. So, they see more roads being built, making the problem worse through their eyes, and quite rightly, while they are being asked to take individual action without it being made easier to do that. So the strong call, and I'm strongly asked that to be very clear about this, is that the cafes would like to see a framework. So, it could be a route map, a national route map that shows the whole picture, that shows with absolute clarity what we have to do, how we are going to do it, what progress we are making, and outlines the roles and responsibilities for everybody, whether that's individuals, local government, public bodies, business and industry, and Scottish Government themselves. That could set out a vision of where we could be, what there is to work towards, and be something positive and hope after this really difficult time and folk are feeling despair and worry. But the message is that people feel this would engage, it would explain with clarity what is going on and bring transparency and accountability to government action where, that might be lacking just now. And the other strong message is that, in order to connect with people and engage with everyday lives, folk would like to see the First Minister lead that and bring that clarity of purpose and leadership and progress or hiccups that people can engage with in their everyday lives. Supported by Cabinet colleagues, understand that this effort reaches right across all sectors for that leadership right from the First Minister to come. So those are some of the ways which have come from our groups, our gatherings, to suggest what could be done to support individual action.
Fabio, have you anything to add?
Yes, thank you, convener, and would be adding to a great set of suggestions from Jess and the climate cafes. Those are great points to make. And Finlay, I think the reality that we have seen locally is, in fact, that transformation and transformative change actually comes from the bottom. It's not to say that government agencies are bad or in any way inadequate. It's not their role usually to lead change. Their role is to make sure that whatever is in place works. And some do that better than others, but it is the way it is. And the real push for change comes from the bottom, and great to hear from Jess about all the suggestions coming from those conversations that have been happening locally. What I think would actually help is actually to encourage a shift to an enabling state. So a state that is not deciding and delivering what services or what change needs to happen, but engaging, enabling and empowering people to actually do the things that need to happen, that people themselves know need to happen in their communities. I mean, we've had for the last few decades, in fact, a great European program was the LEADER program, which is all about community-led local development. Obviously, with Brexit, that's coming to an end, and we're really concerned that what was actually a great local tool for enabling all sorts of activity to be taken forward at the local level is actually going to grind to a halt. So the program for government does talk about replacing that program, but things are going awfully slow. So we would like to see mechanisms that put power in the hands of communities and decision-making powers in the hands of communities, whether it's through programs like LEADER, whether it's through deliberative processes or participative decision-making. Participatory budgeting has not quite got to where it needs to get to. I know there are groups working on that. And to build on Jess's message about joining the dots between various agents at the government level and between the government rhetoric and its delivery, I would also say that we really need to, join the dots between all the actors at the local level that can take things forward, and really capitalise on that huge enthusiasm for change and for helping each other that's actually in our communities and makes them the great places they are.
Thank you. We move on to Mark Ruskell for our final question. Mark.
Yeah, thanks for the comments and the evidence. It's been really interesting this morning. But I wanted to ask you about inequality. There is a risk that we're going to see, widening inequality in our society. So how do you think, briefly, how do you think that the green recovery should really help deliver for all parts of society?
Can I come to Fabio first?
Thank you, convener, and thank you, Mark, for your question. It seems to me, and certainly came up in our local conversations, that sometimes there is a kind of false dichotomy made between just recovery and green recovery, where a green recovery can only be green if it's actually just. If we take green to mean sustainable, then the only way for things to be sustained is for there not to be losers and for people not to be left behind. So I mentioned the various kind of deliberative and participative ways of making decisions or coming to a shared understanding of things, and I think those can really help people to come to a shared understanding and shared action that addresses both elements of that. But I also mentioned earlier on some tools may actually not be at the Scottish Government disposal in terms of making sure that people can meet their basic needs without having to resort to charity and the kindness of strangers. And therefore, what the Scottish Government can do is to make sure that communities themselves are supported, so to actually take forward those actions that are within its gift, and support that kind of capacity building we already mentioned before, that local resilience, that ability to draw on each other's support to meet needs at the local level, to build that resilience. It cannot work by itself. It does need, proper social security and proper support for people, but that may not be within the gift of the Scottish Government.
Jess?
Yeah, obviously climate will impact upon those most vulnerable and least able to afford it in the same, climate change do that in the same way that COVID has exacerbated inequalities, and so the recovery has to be just and green. So how to do that? In terms of the budgets need to be shared in terms of the national budget and how that goes through budgets across the country. It needs to shift from making problems worse to switching to make lives better. For example, in transport, that's clear, and it needs to invest in solutions in enabling change and green jobs. A lot of which can have the dual win of investing in warm homes should reduce fuel poverty, improve health, create local jobs, reduce emissions. We know that public transport investment can and active travel infrastructure can increase, improve health and tackle inequalities as well. There's all sorts of examples. One, just so that we can be sure that we are hearing and understanding the needs of all communities. One thing which we are involved in trying to explore and model with Perth and Kinross Council is to understand what the local government, how those needs can be met, is to connect in informing their strategies through the cafes and all their local connections, so that the informing their strategy, for example, on climate change, can be it can be informed by much more folk within the community. So within the climate cafes, there might be trusted connections with the churches, the schools, the local businesses, individuals who might be creating local solutions which are are serving communities well. And so that is a model which is being worked on at a local government example. We have other examples in learning from how national initiatives to try and achieve outcomes which are good for climate, but also for addressing, for example, fuel poverty, can connect through local initiatives that have been created, but through connection with these cafes and spaces, clearing spaces. So, for example, in Blairgowrie and Rattray, they've got a lot of, they've made a lot of progress in terms of insulation and tackling fuel poverty, because they've got a locally based initiative there which people can access, and it's much more local to them. Scottish Water were trying to do a water efficiency initiative in Dunkeld and Burnham. They had tried doing it in a sort of public facing and supermarket foyers kind of way, and actually when they came to the community and at a local level connected with all the relationships through trusted voices, actually that they found that they made progress on tackling their efficiency targets much better. And the local initiative, the national initiative, which was really good in achieving good outcomes for people, reducing energy bills because they were because of their water efficiencies, as well as their environmental targets, they were actually having greater reach and achieving more in a community. And where those things can be celebrated and learned from and connected up within regions where communities then start to share experiences with others, and that reaches across a wider area and it involves more people in the conversation rather than those who might be normally aware of a national initiative or plugged into just one area of interest. That's some of the learning which I would hope would bring resilience and enable the recovery to be both just and green.
Thank you. We have run out of time. I want to thank you both for your time this morning. It's been very interesting. You've got very fulsome submissions as well that we can draw on to pick up on some of the points you weren't able to make in evidence today. We're going to move on to our final panel on the green recovery today. And with me, we have Peter Mather, the Group Regional President for BP, and we have Arne Gertner, the Senior Vice President for Equinor UK. So welcome to you both. I'm going to hand over to Deputy Convener Finlay Carson to ask the first question.
Good morning and thank you for joining us. In their advice for green recovery, the Just Transition Commission highlighted accelerating transition in the oil and gas sector. Do you agree that the energy transition away from oil and gas is accelerating? And are you confident that the plans set out in the Oil and Gas UK Roadmap 2035 are adequate to support this?
So can we come to Peter first?
Can you hear me, committee?
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, thank you, convener, and nice to see you all. And thank you very much for inviting me to appear in front of your committee. Yes, indeed, the energy transition is accelerating. It is moving in for what we think a very exciting direction towards a net zero world. And you will have seen that BP in February and then reiterated more recently in August and in fact last week, we will also be resetting our company to achieve net zero by 2050 or sooner as well, which, if you think about it, is a pretty extraordinary thing for a company that's been in the oil and gas business predominantly for 110 years. So we're taking this extremely seriously. I think the world is taking this extremely seriously, and I would congratulate Scottish Government and indeed British Government on taking it very seriously here at home too. I think Oil and Gas UK, SCDI, a lot of organisations around this space are doing very, very good things in this area. I think the roadmap that Oil and Gas UK is describing is right. I think it's got to be a mixture of reskilling. It's got to be a mixture of making the North Sea the least emitting environment it possibly can be, and lowering the emissions on the platforms, themselves. It's a fantastic area, the North Sea. We've been here for over 55 years, and we're not planning on leaving anytime soon. So I think there is a lot of work to be done on lowering the carbon footprint of the existing operations, reskilling, but also looking more broadly at the UK and at Scotland. Clearly, there is an agenda as well to expand and diversify beyond oil and gas. But we're very supportive of what Oil and Gas UK have said in their report.
Arne?
Thank you, convener. Good morning, dear committee. The energy is really at the core of society and how we conduct our lives, and whether it's for heating our homes or fueling our transport or the ingredients even in our consumer products, we still rely on oil and gas to meet anticipated energy demand in any likely net zero energy scenario. But what we see is the urgent need to reduce the emissions that come together with this consumption. And the future is, as Peter describes, low carbon. And we also see the energy transition as being real and forceful indeed. Our industry was one of the first industrial sectors to support the UK and Scottish net zero emission targets through the publication of the Roadmap 2035, and collectively we have, as an industry, committed to halving production emissions from the UKCS by 2030, with the aim of contributing to the 2050 goal. And speaking, for Equinor, we have ambitions to make our operations carbon neutral by 2030, grow renewable energy capacity tenfold by 2026, and by 2050, halve the net carbon intensity of the energy we produce over its full life cycle. So I think this is definitely heading in the right direction, and that's supported by the revision of the OGA strategy to incorporate net zero ambitions will further strengthen the energy integration and drive change in oil and gas. And of course, the North Sea transition deal being discussed currently with the UK government as well. Potentially has the ability to stimulate new investments in net zero solutions through policies and funding mechanisms that further encourage the change in a sustainable way.
I'd like to ask you both very specific questions about the just transition for your workforces. I mean, you may know that there's a couple of us here in the committee that are from the northeast of Scotland, represent the northeast of Scotland, and the local economy there is very heavily reliant on oil and gas. We have an awful lot of constituents who work in oil and gas. But we're concerned that companies like yourself, that this transition is taking place with or without you. And the people who work for you want to see a future where they can work still have work, good work, well-paying work, but not in carbon-emitting industry. What are you doing as a company, as an individual, a concrete example of what you're doing to transition away from oil and gas into other energy sources? And what are you doing to enable your workforce to train and to transition themselves into those areas? So can I come to Peter first?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And I mean, I can tell you, having worked in BP for a long time, you find the Scottish accent everywhere across the whole of the company, whether it's in the UK, Azerbaijan, Texas, West Africa. So the Scottish contribution in terms of the skills and the expertise to a company like BP and to the industry in general has been massive over the years. So we don't take that lightly. I think there are a couple of elements here. I mean, I think what the transition is about is moving away over time from oil and gas and moving towards new energies, renewable energies, different technologies. It's not going to be a sort of tap off tomorrow and you tap on the next day. It is a transition. So there will be extremely good and valuable jobs for quite a long time longer in the oil and gas sector. Those jobs might be focusing much more on how to reduce the carbon footprint of that sector. And indeed, they might well, I mean, for example, subsurface engineers might well transfer their skills more to carbon capture and storage. So to apply their ability to see what's below the seabed and apply it to a new industry, which we're very keen to encourage, as indeed our Equinor, called carbon capture and storage. So I think it's about making sure that people coming into the industry understand that they might be doing slightly different roles to what they were doing before, but the core skills of big projects, of applying technology, of commercial expertise, of understanding the parameters around a business, that those skills are still very much going to be there. So yes, we are increasing our investment quite substantially, tenfold over the next few years in renewable energy. So a lot of our staff will transition over to that area, as well as bringing in new people. But we will also make sure that the roles that do remain in the oil and gas sector, and there'll be many for quite a long time to come, will be rewarding, interesting, and very much focused on reducing the emissions as we head towards net zero. So I think it's actually a very exciting time to be coming into energy. I've always felt it's an exciting time, but I think now is a particularly exciting time.
Do you see BP transitioning fully into renewables at one stage?
Well, I think if you look far ahead, quite possibly. I mean, I think we've said initially we will be reducing our production of oil and gas by around 40% by 2030, and we'll be increasing our investment in low carbon, in renewables by about tenfold over the same period. So you can see there's quite a significant shift going on, and that's just out to 2030. So when you get to 2050, where we will be net zero, I think we will still be producing some oil, probably still quite a lot of gas combined with carbon capture and storage. But I can't venture a percentage, but I should think we will be dominated by low carbon and renewable energies.
Okay, Arne?
Thank you, convener. Let me re-emphasize that this is a transition over time. Of course, oil and gas still has a role to play in and however, to support our transition, we in Equinor, we have, established our own business area within Equinor to lead the new business opportunities arising from the transition. And let me be specific here as well. We have sourced the new business area almost entirely from the own organization. So that is also a transition internally in terms of competence and workforce traditionally having been working in upstream oil and gas and now working with renewables and we see definitely moving back and forth between the two and our project competence and so forth is applied in equal ways. I have also direct examples of geologists working for me up in Aberdeen and now actually being seconded down to helping the Teesside project and Humber Teesside project with the CCUS and equally one of my maintenance leaders now supporting the Dogger Bank project on the offshore safety side. So I think it's a lot awful lot of transferable skills, and somehow we sometimes underestimate that's what this industry is bringing to the table in terms of competence and skills, and quite a great workforce indeed. But we have okay.
All right, carry on.
And you know, I just wanted to make the point that we have set the ambition to grow in the renewables energy space massively, and for instance, offshore wind is one of our main pillars in that growth ambition, and you can see an example of that in our, you know, just outside our upstream headquarters outside Aberdeen, the first floating wind farm, Highwind Scotland, and what that has meant for the wind development as such. And we strongly believe that more floating wind farms will come and take you know, the good potential and more powerful potential and reliable energy in even deeper waters, and not least, you know, our investments into the Dogger Bank project on the UK shelf as well, together with our with our partner SSE Renewables, which is, you know, the world's largest offshore wind farm. You know, accounting when finished around 5% of the UK's electricity demand. So it shows that we, you know, that we are very, very much committed in the transition, and as such, and you know, I think the list continues, of course, on the fact that. We need to see even more ways to reduce our carbon footprints as such, and to increase thereby also our low carbon products. And hydrogen is one of the levers we really believe in, and maybe the destination fuel for the future as well. And we are strongly committed to our Humber project, the H2H Salton pilot plant, which we believe can be one of the first and one of the biggest, clean hydrogen plants in the world, utilizing blue hydrogen from gas, but storing the CO2 down below this seabed in the North Sea.
Thank you. And that's a question from Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, thanks, convener. BP in particular has been accused of spending millions of dollars on lobbying to undermine the action needed to implement the Paris Agreement. Can I ask you how aligned with that Paris Agreement are your business models, where, you know, on one hand you're getting public support for renewable investment, while on the other hand you're still maximising global opportunities for extracting fossil fuels?
Okay, thank you. I think that was for me. Thank you for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. I mean, I think the key thing for us is that this is a transition, and you know, we have made it crystal clear in February, in August, and in fact just recently again with investor presentations last week, where we're heading. Nobody should have any doubt whatsoever where we're heading. We have put ourselves well in front of the curve. We have committed to being a net zero company by 2050 or sooner. We've committed to extraordinary, if you think about it, to reduce our production of oil and gas. For a traditional oil and gas company to be saying that is, I don't think anybody could doubt our sincerity when we're putting very clear targets out there like that. So it's exciting. It's where we think we should go as a company. We just believe it's very much the right thing to do. We could not continue with a pure oil and gas model when the world clearly needs to change to something different. So we think of ourselves now as in this transition from what was an IOC, an integrated oil company, international oil company, to an IEC, an integrated energy company. involving lots of different activities, and I talked about some of our spend profiles earlier. So we are absolutely embracing the transition. We're absolutely lockstep with governments around the world to get to net zero by 2050 or sooner. And if you spend any time in BP at the moment, you'll see just how the company is completely changing from top to tail as we embrace this vision. It's very, very exciting.
Can I just ask you then?
Sorry, Mark, did you want to ask another question of Peter, or do you want to go to Arne?
It was just a follow-up, actually, perhaps for both if they want to comment. We've currently got around 5.7 billion barrels of oil in the North Sea under the reserves that are currently being exploited. The industry's target, as I understand it, which you're both part of, is to extract 20 billion barrels. Now, I wanted to ask you, do you think that is in line with the Paris Agreement? If we burnt 20 billion barrels of oil, is that in line with Paris? Or do you expect all of that to go through carbon capture and storage?
Shall I come in, Convener?
Yeah, I'll come to Peter now, I'll come to Arne, and then we'll have to move on to the next questioner. Peter.
I think the challenge for the North Sea is obviously to be efficient, cost effective, but most of all to lower the emissions associated with North Sea production. I think we can do that. A lot of the emissions, 75% of the emissions, come from the sort of power generation offshore. There are lots of things we can do, and we're looking at already, like exporting green power from the shore out to the rigs. So the North Sea can do a lot. It's also a province where we're blessed with years and years, 55 years of investment. So the infrastructure's there, the skill set's there. And we've said quite clearly that we're not going to be exploring in brand new places. But we do think that places like the North Sea have a great future. The future for oil itself, there will be, and the government said this recently, there will be residual demand for oil, come what may, in petrochemicals and lots of sort of pharmaceuticals and areas like that. Transportation is clearly where there'll be less demand for oil, and you know, as the largest charger of electric vehicles in the UK, we're right at the forefront of that too. Natural gas, clearly carbon capture and storage, we believe, as do Equinor and others, can play a massive role in effectively decarbonising our indigenous homegrown natural gas supplies. So I think the North Sea has an exciting future. We need to work hard at it, which we will do, and we need the commitment of companies like ours to see it through, and we're certainly extremely committed to the North Sea, very excited.
Arne?
Strongly support the view of the North Sea as a whole basin, and we have a tremendous track record in reducing carbon emissions in the North Sea, where we have very strict internal targets on the way forward on the scope 1 emissions related to oil and gas extraction. But we are also record low on the emission side in the North Sea, and with continued policies making and continued investment in, for instance, electrification of oil and gas plants, hydrogen projects as described before. We are also seeing a future fit of the oil and gas industry as a low carbon contribution, because we also have to see that there will, as I have iterated before, there will still be a need for oil and gas in the energy mix going forward as well, it's then deciding upon where this energy supply will come from, and where I believe the North Sea has a competitive advantage of supplying low carbon fossil fuels in the future as well.
Can I come on to questions from Liz Smith?
Thank you, Convener. The panellists will be very aware of the recommendations that have been made for the Scottish Council for Development and Industry. Firstly, that they would like to see the Green Jobs Transition Task Force. And secondly, that they would like to see a green reskilling and upskilling fund. If these go ahead, could I ask what role you think you would be able to play in these?
Arne?
Definitely. I mean, supporting the UK offshore oil and gas industry and its highly skilled workforce will be important part for Scotland and the UK in meeting the net zero emission targets and ambitions. And as you know, as I've explained, you know, in Equinor we see that, you know, traditional oil and gas competence is very, very valuable for the energy transition as well, and upskilling enables us to keep critical and key competence in the energy sector, and it's not about oil and gas and renewables. It's energy sector with a lot of transferable skills. But what's we requires, of course, continued investment into Scotland and the wider UK, where we are creating jobs, supporting the supply chain, which is, of course, is very, very important, and investing into local communities and creating wider and shared value and ripple effects. We support the transition of our own oil and gas workforce into renewables, and again we see also some moving back again, and I think that is really what this industry can bring to the table going forward as well.
And can I come to Peter?
Yeah, so we've been active member of SCDI for many years, and indeed were part of the Clean Growth Leadership Group that helped develop the report. I mean, we completely embrace this agenda, and in many ways, what we're doing now in BP is both upskilling and green reskilling. So we are, as I say, shifting our investment portfolio quite significantly away from traditional oil and gas into renewables and low carbon energy and new technologies like hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. And we want to take our people with us to do that. Clearly we are hiring some expertise from outside, but we have such talented people in the organization that we're also going to reskill a lot of them as well. And I really go back to the point I made. I do think that this is a really exciting time to come into the energy industry. Because you'll be working on a whole lot of different things, but some things will be common. The attitude, approach to risk, application of technology. How do you bring together big projects, project management skills? These are all skills that Scotland and the UK have in abundance. So we've just got to make sure that we reskill, reorientate those skills towards these new projects and not lose them. And I think we can do that. So short answer is the SCDI report, I think, is excellent, and we will work very closely on this agenda with them and with others.
I'm going to come on to Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Camilla. I just want to focus very tightly on a simple thing. There's new licensing rounds for North Sea. In relation to BP's target to reduce output by 40% in less than 10 years' time, how does that square with BP having bid for three rounds in the bidding there? And to Equinor, have you got any plans to bid for new licenses? BP first, perhaps.
Come to Peter first.
Thank you very much for the question. It's a super question. And just very clearly, we will not be exploring in new parts of the world, but where we have experience and familiarity, like the North Sea, where we've been 5+ years, we will want to continue to be there. You know, we believe in the province. We believe that we can add value and do things in the right way in the North Sea. And so, you know, we will not rule out any sort of further exploration at all in that province. We won't chase the difficult new areas of the world where, frankly, you know, the expense, the risk is not commensurate with the reward. But where we know there are skilled people, there's a regulatory environment that we know and trust, like in the North Sea, yes, we will continue to take opportunities.
Do forgive me, Peter. Yes. Where does the 40% reduction come from if you're continuing to look to exploit your existing assets to a greater extent in the North Sea, as you've just said?
Well, it's a very, very fair question. I mean, I know you know our industry well. Our industry typically, you know, every field has a life. It falls off. So in a lot of places, we probably won't be replenishing, we won't be renewing our stock, and we won't be bringing any new exploration. But, you know, 40% reduction in our oil and gas production still means that we'll be producing, you know, 1.5 million barrels a day in 2030. But we want those to be the cleanest, most efficient, lowest emitting barrels that we have in our portfolio. And that's where I think the North Sea has a role to play, because, you know, we're very bullish, frankly, about what the North Sea can do around its own carbon footprint in the province.
And can I come to Arnie?
Thank you, convener. Equinor was awarded 5 licenses in the recent 32nd licensing round, and we see the UK offshore licensing round a great vehicle to add new opportunities into our UK portfolio, and it's really about high grading the portfolio in line with our exploration strategy in a way. And as mentioned, the North Sea, you know, we see that clearly being part of a low carbon oil and gas future. And we will continue to invest in new opportunities where we see potential for value creation, particularly in prolific basins, and the advantage the North Sea brings with it, with the existing infrastructures and you know, policy making on both sides, bringing it with it.
Okay, can I come to questions from Claudia Beamish?
Thank you, convener. And can I highlight, in evidence to the committee, Benny Higgins noted, I quote, he highlighted the need to pursue conditionality with some vigour to try to understand how we can use it as a filter to ensure that we invest in the right places, projects and businesses that have the right focus, culture and attitude. And on the back of that comment and discussions we've had with you as a panel, can I ask you very specifically, should any public support for the oil and gas sector be explicitly linked to supporting a just transition towards a net zero future?
Okay, shall I come to Arnie first?
Thank you, convener, for the question. What we see is the need for sustainable funding mechanisms, encourage continued investment and delivery towards the emission reduction targets in both in Scotland and UK going forward. And funding mechanisms that can be maintained for longer term, you know, such as those established on the Norwegian continental shelf, for instance, encourage you know, investment into new technology and thereby also is reducing especially scope 1 emissions from operations. And whether it's, you know, electrification, hydrogen, CCUS, and so forth, you know, support is needed to incentivize these new projects and to bring scale rapidly. I think that is a key takeaway. Then in turn, it unlocks, future investment from the industry, from the sector, and also creates a lot of activity and for our highly skilled workforce and the supply chain. And what I note is that Norway and other countries we operate in are using the current downturn to accelerate investments to create jobs and support green transitions, for sure.
So could I just clarify, and then for Peter as well? I'm asking thank you for that answer. I'm asking very specifically whether any public support should be attached to the just transition towards a net zero future. Should there be that absolutely explicit conditionality in your view?
Well, I think that government.
I wanted to hear from. Sorry, Peter. I just hear specifically.
Excuse me, we can come back to Arne. Can we take Peter first?
All right.
Can answer your question, and we'll come back to Arne for his response. Peter, carry on.
Right. Sorry, apologies for jumping in.
I don't apologise.
I mean, I think I just make a couple of points. The net zero by 2050 or sooner is probably the most important thing that we should all be investing in going forward. There is willing investment out there. I mean, we've already said we're going to increase tenfold over the next few years our investment in low carbon and renewable energies. There's money there. All that's needed is sort of the frameworks and the business models, so that investors have some confidence that their investment will at least return adequately. So that's really where I think the policy focus should be, providing those business models. I think there's the UK is blessed with quite a lot of opportunities here, because we're surrounded by sea. Carbon capture and storage is a real option. Hydrogen's a real option, both blue and green hydrogen. We have the North Sea. We are leading actually in electrification. I mean, there's a lot. The UK's got a lot going for it. I think both regional and national governments just need to sort of nudge us along. But there is a real support for investment. And I suppose I just go back to this is an imperative. We have to invest in this. And obviously any transition needs to be commensurate with, the skill set, with the needs of the community, which is why I come back to this point. You can't turn one tap off today and turn another tap on tomorrow. We've got to sort of gradually change and develop and transit away from a largely hydrocarbon-based world to a different world. But we've got to do that in a fair way and take people with us. But I think the key thing is the right business models. The money's there, the investment's coming. Just the right business models to make these projects investable.
We are seriously over time, Claudia. I don't know if we have time to come back to Arne, because I have to bring in Angus MacDonald with a final question. Angus.
You'll both be aware that in Scotland, many of us look enviously across the North Sea to the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Norway, now sitting, as I understand it, at well over $1 trillion US. Meanwhile, Scotland or the UK has never set up an oil fund. So, based on the Norwegian experience of its Sovereign Wealth Fund, are there lessons to learn for Scotland or the UK to support an intergenerational green recovery?
Come to Arne first.
Thank you for that question. Well, for me as an industry leader, maybe that's beyond my remit to comment on. But I just want to make sure for clarity that Equinor is listed on the stock exchange in both Oslo and New York, and our shares are owned by the Norwegian government and private investors as such. And the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is managed by the Norwegian Central Bank and the formal framework for their investment policy is decided by the Norwegian Parliament, and all of the investment policy is regularly up for political debate. Equinor does not have a standpoint on that as such. But what we see is, the Norwegian government clearly committed to heavily invest in the transition. And there was an announcement made yesterday by the Prime Minister to support and substantially invest basically in the carbon capture and storage value chain and the Northern Light project. And I think that's an example of that.
Right, we are probably going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much to the both of you for your time this morning. Sorry we've had to rush at the end, but we have really run out of time. We've got one more item of business to get done today. We're going to suspend this meeting briefly to allow the Minister and her officials to come on to the broadcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
The second item on our agenda is to take evidence on the Marine Licensing Exempted Activities Scottish Inshore Region Amendment Order 2020 from the Minister and her officials. Now welcome Mary Goujon, the Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment. And the Minister is joined by Joyce Carr, the Head of Water Environment, and Jane Rugvie, the Head of Aquaculture for the Scottish Government. Good morning to you all. Good morning, Minister. We would like to, there's a couple of members who'd like to ask you a couple of questions in relation to this instrument. Mark Ruskell has some questions for you.
Afternoon, everybody. And I have got a number of questions because I think, we are seeing real fish health crisis at the moment. And obviously, this is part of the context of that. So can I ask you to start with, what proportion of the treatments are we seeing of farmed salmon being undertaken by wellboats as opposed to tarpaulin-based methods? Are we seeing an increase in the use of wellboats as a treatment method?
Wellboats and tarpaulins. We may have to check some people's microphones might be on. Okay, we'll try that again. Was it Jane Rugvie was coming in there? Jane.
Wellboats and tarpaulins are used equally by farmers on their fish farms. I can't tell you what the proportion is. They make a decision what's suitable for the fish that they're treating at the time. If you want some statistics, I can go back to the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation and ask for these statistics, but it really depends on the farm at the time and the solutions that they're using.
I think that would be very useful, Convener, if we could get some data, because these regulations are about regulating potentially a growing source of treatment for our fish farms. So I think getting transparency on that would be really useful. Can I, on the back of that, then ask another question? A number of community stakeholders are concerned that with the wellboat operations that they are seeing, that a number of these wellboats are then moving away from the fish farms to then discharge effluent back into the sea. And there's concerns around perhaps a lack of monitoring or a lack of adequate monitoring about where these discharges are taking place, because they're not taking place right next to the fish farm, but also what they're discharging as well. And there's been a lot of speculation about what is actually coming out of these wellboats back into sea and what the impact might be. And that's compounded perhaps by an exemption within these regulations based on force majeure. So if an operator decides that, there's particularly bad weather conditions, or they judge it to be a safety issue, then they can just discharge effectively where they want to. So can I ask about how, with these new regulations, you're going to be monitoring and ensuring that there's transparency about how the wellboats are discharging, indeed where they're discharging and what they're discharging?
First of all, I'm just going to answer that by saying that if there are any particular concerns by communities that Mark Ruskell's aware of, then please do contact me about that, because obviously that's something we want to be aware of to make sure that we are looking into that. Now, essentially what this SSI does is simplify the licensing process, and that makes it's simpler for both the regulators and for the operators themselves as well. So it doesn't change in any way the restrictions or all the regulations that would currently be in place. So there wouldn't be any sort of diminution of that. So essentially this, again, as I've just said, it simplifies that whole process for the regulators. SEPA had been consulted in the drafting of this, and their feedback was taken on board and influenced the final draft of the order that we've got as well. And even if somebody was applying for a marine licence, Marine Scotland would normally consult with SEPA for an input on those marine licences as well. So it's just something that really makes sense to happen, and for rather than operators having to go through the process right now of applying for a marine licence and then a car licence, for it to all fall under the car licence. So again, if there are particular concerns there, then please do let me know about that. So again, we can look into that. But we wouldn't anticipate that this would be an added burden for SEPA in terms of the regulation or the monitoring it, or any different to what should be happening at the moment.
Okay.
Finish, Mark, or can I come back? One more question.
Another couple of questions, if that's all right, Convener, if we've got time.
Carry on, and then we'll come to Audrey.
So I think in response to that, there has been concerns that have been raised by communities with Marine Scotland. I think what I'm interested in is, yes, this simplifies process for licensing now. It transfers the responsibility fully to SEPA. What I'm interested in is, will there then be a change in the way that these licenses are then being monitored? It does appear to be a bit of a break point in the way that these license operations have been taking place. And if there was an opportunity for reform, greater disclosure of information for communities, better monitoring, this might be the opportunity to do that. Can I just wrap in my final question then on the back of that, which is that there has been concern about disclosure in relation to chemicals that are used. Hydrogen peroxide, for example, is a chemical which in some circumstances could have quite a low impact in the environment if it's being dispersed. But in certain circumstances where there isn't a lot of flushing within a coastal area or a loch, then it could have quite a high environmental impact. So as part of this kind of reform of the way that the regulations are and the licensing is being issued to these operators, will there also be reforms in terms of the disclosure of the chemicals that are being released and the kind of quantities of chemicals that are being released, including those like hydrogen peroxide, which could have an impact on the environment if they were discharged in a way that's responsible?
Thank you for the question. Just to say, as part of the strengthened regulatory framework that they published in June 2019, that would encapsulate all that. So that would mean that there would be more monitoring, and it would also capture the second point that you raised as well. And then further to that, in July, they also published the Finfish Aquaculture Sector Plan. So that would definitely be taken into consideration within that.
Can I come on to a question from Claudia Beamish?
You, Minister and officials. It really builds on Mark's question, so I'll be brief. It's very much about the disclosure of what is actually being discharged and what degree is there an obligation on the company to disclose what is being discharged. Been raised about that and the possible effect on the marine environment more widely. Thank you.
Minister.
Again, I would just reiterate the response that I gave to Mark Ruskell there, because since the environment and rural economy recommendations on environmental regulation that were made for the aquaculture sector, again, there was the SEPA published their strengthened regulatory framework. So again, that captures a lot of the points that you've just made and that Mark Ruskell made as well.
Can I come to a question from Stuart Stevenson?
Thank you very much, Convener. I just have a very simple, straightforward question for the Minister. Given that this is simplifying the regime of oversight and will presumably improve enforcement of what's going on, given that this is a very important industry for many of our coastal communities and one which I wish to see being as successful in the future as it has been in the past, will this make it easier for the regulator to make sure the right things are happening, but more importantly for the industry to continue to be as successful as it has been in the past?
Minister.
Yes, you're absolutely right in that, and you're absolutely right. This is a sector for Scotland, but we've also got to ensure that it is environmentally sustainable too. And that's where, again, this simplified process, it really just cuts down the burden. Like, again, applying for 2 licences when Marine Scotland would have to consult with SEPA anyway. It simplifies that whole process and makes it easier both for SEPA as the regulator as well as for the operators. A lot more simple and understandable process.
Thank you. And can I come to Finlay Carson?
Hey, thank you, Convener. A very straightforward question. This instrument is, the purpose of it is just to transfer or to exempt an activity. Is there anything that the controlled activities regulations don't pick up when this is made exempt from the Marine Scotland Act? Is there anything left behind, or is absolutely everything transferred? And I'll ask a second question on this. If this is simplifying things, are we likely to see more instruments come forward which transfer this sort of power from or obligation from Marine Scotland to SEPA in the future?
Minister?
Just in relation to the first point of Finlay Carson's question, in relation to pollution, everything transfers across. So there wouldn't be anything exempt as part of this compared to what there was before. And sorry, could I just ask him to repeat the second part of his question?
Yes, certainly. If this is just going through the process of simplifying things and transferring certain obligations or licensing from Marine Scotland, are we likely to see more of these instruments come forward in other areas of marine licensing?
There aren't any plans to transfer.
Sorry, I think James was just coming in there.
Yeah, sorry, there aren't any other plans to transfer any other obligations across, because there aren't any other ones that read across in such a way. So that was the only one that we've identified where it's benefiting from better regulation by being monitored by SEPA.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Minister, is there anything that you would like to add before we move on in relation to this instrument?
No, nothing further, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Right, so we're going to move to our next agenda item today, and to invite the Minister to move motion S5M 22577 that the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee recommends that the Marine Licensing Exempted Activities Scottish Inshore Region Amendment Order 2020 be approved. I now invite the Minister to speak to and move the motion.
Happy to formally move the motion, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. Can I remind officials they're not permitted to speak to this agenda item? I now invite members who have any comments. If you would have any comments, if you would like to let me know in the chat box, I'll give you a couple of seconds to do that. Otherwise, I'll just put the question. Claudia.
I like the points that were made about the importance of disclosure and these concerns from the community, and also that these issues must still the Welber issue. We must be sure that it is robustly monitored. Thank you. Otherwise, I'm happy to support.
Thank you, Claudia. Mark.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I'm happy to support this simplification of the licensing process. I listened carefully to what the Minister said in relation to the information that can be provided back to the committee about the increasing use of wellboats. And I listened also to comments about SEPA's strengthened fish health framework, which has been brought out. And I think, perhaps that's an area of further scrutiny, because if that framework doesn't adequately cover the kind of issues that have been raising today on behalf of communities in relation to wellboats, then clearly that would be some work for SEPA to very quickly do before rolling out this new simplified regulatory process.
Thank you. It doesn't appear that we have any other comments, so I'm going to put the question. The question is that motion S5M 22577 in the name of Rosanna Cunningham be approved. Are we all agreed? And if we're not agreed, could you let us know? We are agreed. So that motion is now passed and we are all agreed. Thank you. I want to thank the Minister and our officials for their time this morning. That concludes the public part of the meeting today. Our next meeting will be on the 29th of September, and the committee will discuss its programme in private at its next meeting. Our final agenda, sorry, I'm getting confused. That is the end of the public part of the meeting. Thank you all.